They marched from the walls of Winterfell at dawn, an unlikely pair at the head of the column. Eddard Stark and Daenerys Targaryen side by side. Behind them trailed thousands of men, their breath steaming in the frigid air, their spears and banners catching the early light. Horses snorted, hooves crunching over the frosted ground. The call of horns echoed across the plain, answered by the distant shrieks of dragons wheeling overhead. The watchers left behind, cooks and stewards, old men and children, stood on the ramparts or along the snowy roads, gazing in awe at the departure of an army unlike any the North had ever seen. Ned felt the weight of memory as he rode beyond the outer gate of Winterfell. He had left this place before, following King Robert south and never expecting the turn of fate that awaited him in King's Landing. He thought of those times, how the world had seemed so much simpler. He had gone to serve as Hand of the King, only to be drawn into a web of deceit and danger that forced him to flee with his daughters, crossing the narrow sea to join a Targaryen princess he had once considered an enemy by birth. Now they marched together beneath a sky thick with the promise of more snow, forging a bond that might change the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Daenerys rode astride a strong black mare, clad in leathers beneath a thick fur mantle. A swirl of white wolf fur draped across her shoulders, courtesy of the Manderleys, who had taken to calling her the Dragon of Winter in hushed, admiring tones. She did not wear a crown. None would have been practical out here, and she had always kept her adornments simple. Yet there was a regal air to the way she held herself. Chin lifted, silver hair braided in a style that mixed Dothraki bells with northern practicality. Overhead, her 3 dragons soared, Black Drogon leading, with Viserion and Regal following in graceful sweeps. Their presence drew every eye, and their roars occasionally thundered across the fields, rattling the more skittish horses in the rear columns. Ned heard the low murmurs in the ranks, even as his mind spun with planning. The North had rallied in surprising numbers. Many men had marched down from the lonely hills, from Bear Island, from the stony coasts and mountain valleys. Others had ridden from smaller holdfasts, proud of their chance to stand beside House Stark once more, and newly curious about this Targaryen queen with her living dragons. Houses Serwyn and Tallheart had joined quickly, while the Umbers, true to their boisterous nature, arrived in loud gatherings that doubled as feasting. More hesitant were the Karstarks and the Boltons, but ultimately they had come. By the time they'd mustered at Moat Cailin, Ned knew this host would swell to nearly 15,000 strong. Daenerys had left a token garrison of her own men in White Harbor to protect the port in case enemies tried to land by sea. For the moment, the bulk of her associate allies, especially the Dothraki, remained scattered, some across the narrow sea, some making the slow transit west. But a small group of Dothraki outriders accompanied her, a reminder of the broader might she could call upon. They passed beyond the winter-stripped fields around Winterfell, heading for the King's Road that cut south through the neck. Pine trees stood like silent witnesses, their branches burdened with old snow. A biting wind raced across the plains, stinging any unprotected skin. Daenerys shivered, though she tried to hide it, and Ned offered a thin, wry smile of sympathy. "You'll see worse cold than this if winter comes in earnest," he said quietly, so only she could hear. She replied, "I believe you. I never thought I would become so familiar with fur cloaks. In Essos, the heat was often unbearable." "Strange how the world changes," Ned said, and left it at that. They spent the better part of 5 days making the trek to Moat Cailin. The fortress, if it could still be called that, rose from the swampy lands at the top of the neck, its ancient towers half ruined. Once, in the age of the First Men, Moat Cailin had guarded the north against southern invasion. Its walls had fallen into disrepair over centuries, but even in partial ruin it was formidable, for the bogs and choke points around it made any large army slow and vulnerable. Ned's father had told him stories of how a handful of determined northerners could hold Moat Cailin against seemingly endless assaults, especially once the swamps and crumbling causeways were fully taken into account. Now, that old fortress served as the mustering point for the lords of the north. When the vanguard of Ned's party arrived, Great John Umber greeted them with a thunderous laugh, clapping Ned on the back hard enough to make him rock in the saddle. A ring of smaller lords waited in the courtyard within the battered walls. They bowed or dipped their heads upon seeing Daenerys, though some could not disguise their nervous glances at the dragons, who roost atop the broken towers. Smoke curled from Drogon's nostrils, dissipating in the cold air. In the distance, men pitched tents and formed campfires on higher, firmer ground, avoiding the bogs that threatened to swallow the unwary. The next day, more of the northern army flooded in, a sea of fur-clad warriors bearing sigils of bears, mermen, flayed men, and direwolves. Ser Barristan Selmy and Jorah Mormont immediately took to assessing supply lines, speaking with quartermasters, and ensuring the men had enough provisions to march south. Daenerys conferred with Ned in a makeshift war tent set up inside the partial shelter of Moat Cailin's largest tower. Torches flickered, revealing a sprawling map of the Riverlands pinned down by stones to keep the draft from scattering it. Around them stood Robb Stark, Great Jon Umber, Roose Bolton, Lady Meage Mormont, and a handful of other prominent lords. All wore armor or heavy cloaks against the chill. Daenerys trailed a hand across the map, tracing a route from the neck into the Riverlands. "We must pass the Twins," she said, pointing to the crossing of the Green Fork under the command of Walder Frey. "Unless we plan to go a longer way round, which could take weeks we do not have." Robb's brow furrowed. "And dealing with Walder Frey is seldom pleasant. My mother's family, the Tullys, have reason to be wary of him. Still, if we go to Riverrun's aid, we'll have to cross at some point. The Trident flows wide. The only other routes are far out of our way, unwise if time is short." Roose Bolton's voice was soft, almost polite. "We might consider forcing the Twins, but the Freys have a fortress at each bank, and their crossing is heavily guarded. It would be costly in lives, and it might drive the Freys fully into the Lannister camp." Ned drummed his fingers against the table. "We know Walder Frey's character. He plays all sides, waiting to see who offers the greatest advantage. Perhaps, if we offer certain concessions, he'll open his gates. He'll want to ensure he's on the winning side. At the same time, we can't allow him to demand too much. If we appear desperate, he'll smell weakness." Daenerys inclined her head. "Then we approach him. We show our strength, but also indicate that an alliance with us is more profitable than opposing us. Once across, we move on the Lannister raiders in the Riverlands, secure Riverrun, and push east toward Harrenhal or perhaps even King's Landing if the moment is right." Great Jon Umber let out a rumble of agreement. "Aye, we smash the lion in the Riverlands, then ride all the way to the throne if need be. This talk of Freys is but a stepping stone." Bolton's pale gaze flicked to Daenerys. "Stepping stone or not, Great Jon, the Twins can become a grave if we misjudge. Lord Walder is cunning. We must be sure the Queen's presence, and her dragons, don't alarm him into closing his gates entirely." Daenerys's mouth tightened a fraction. "I will not hide my dragons for the sake of appeasing a fickle man, Lord Bolton. But perhaps I need not fly them directly overhead as we approach. We can manage our entrance with caution." Ned nodded. "Precisely. We'll send riders ahead to treat with Lord Walder. If he's amenable, we march through peacefully. If not, we consider alternative routes or the possibility of seizing the crossing by force, but that must be a last resort." They spent hours hashing out details, scribbling notes, sending out couriers. In the end, they decided to dispatch a small group of envoys to the Twins with an offer of alliance, reaffirmation of old Tully Frey ties, plus certain trade privileges with White Harbor if they cooperated. To underscore that refusal might be dangerous, they would drop polite hints of the dragons that marched behind the northern host. Walder Frey valued his own skin above all else. Perhaps that alone would sway him. Meanwhile, the bulk of the army would continue its slow approach, stopping short of the Freys' territory to await the response. The following morning, Daenerys rose at first light and stepped outside her tent. Frost glittered on the broken flagstones of Moat Cailin. A hush lay over the camp, broken only by distant footsteps of guards changing shifts and the crackle of campfires. She gazed at the largest tower, where Drogon perched like a black gargoyle. Smoke whirled from his nostrils. Rhaegal and Viserion were curled together on a patch of rubble warmed by coals the men had placed for them. Seeing the dragons in such a dreary, swampy setting was surreal, as though a piece of Essos had come to brood over ancient northern ruins. Ned emerged from an adjacent tent, greeting Daenerys with a respectful nod. "Your Grace, any news from the envoys?" She let out a soft breath. "Not yet. I imagine they're still on the way to the Twins. We'll likely hear in a few days at the earliest." Ned rubbed his hands together to warm them. "Time enough to gather the rest of our men. Manderly's contingent should arrive within 2 days. Others are trickling in from the foothills. Once we're assembled, we'll move south." Daenerys studied the quiet expanse of marshland. "I wonder if Joffrey and Cersei realize how large a host we're forming. Their spies must be at work. Perhaps they hope the weather will slow us, or they think we'll remain in the north. When we strike, it must be swift." He agreed with a grave tilt of his head. "Tywin Lannister has cunning, and the resources of Casterly Rock. But the realm is fracturing. With Renly calling himself king in the Reach, the Lannisters can't easily command the Tyrells. And the Riverlands might yet unite behind us if we free them from Tywin's raids. The Vale remains a question, but my sister by marriage, Lisa Arryn, is reclusive. I doubt we'll get help from her." She tightened her cloak around her shoulders, half lost in thought. "One step at a time, then. First the Twins, then Riverrun." Over the next days, the army around Moat Cailin swelled further, men and horses flooding every solid patch of ground. Wagons full of grain and salted fish arrived from White Harbor, ensuring the host could march without starving. Squires hustled about, polishing armor, feeding horses, repairing harnesses. Blacksmiths hammered steel day and night, forging new swords, arrowheads, and spear points. Daenerys had never seen such a gathering in Westeros. Not even King Robert's host could have been this large, though that was not her memory but gleaned from old stories. She walked among the camps with Ned at times, meeting the men, speaking with knights and bannermen. Some stared in awe at the silver-haired queen, some at the dragons overhead. Others, especially the hardened northerners, treated her with the blunt respect they accorded any strong leader. She found it refreshing compared to the flowery, suspicious courtesies of Karth or Pentos. Occasionally, she glimpsed tension among the ranks. The men of House Bolton were quiet and watchful, seldom mingling with others. Daenerys noticed them whispering among themselves, though no open sign of treachery emerged. Roose Bolton himself appeared at councils, offering measured words of support. Ned had warned her that Bolton was not to be trusted blindly, that he valued advantage above loyalty. But for now, the man seemed content to stand with the Starks. Daenerys had no choice but to accept his presence in the alliance, aware that the demands of war often forced alliances with those less than fully dependable. At last, word came from the twins. Walder Frey agreed, in principle, to grant passage, but wanted certain conditions confirmed in writing, including potential marriages or betrothals to strengthen the bond. The envoys had not promised anything. They merely carried back the old man's demands. Ned and Robb studied them with some exasperation. "Walder Frey is an opportunist," Ned said, shaking his head. "We expected nothing less, but we cannot let him hold us at the crossing for ransom. Time is precious." They held another gathering in the half-ruined Great Hall of Moat Cailin, torchlight flickering on wet stone walls. Daenerys read over Walder Frey's demands. He wants a betrothal to a daughter or granddaughter. He wants formal recognition as paramount lord of the Trident, which he's not. He wants gold from White Harbor, and he insists that I appear personally at the twins to show good faith. Her lip curled. Robb's eyes flashed. "He would love to snare one of our family in a marriage bargain. My mother, no doubt, would strangle him first. As for you traveling to the twins in person, that's an obvious attempt to put you in his power. Unacceptable." Ned tapped the hilt of his sword, thinking. "He might be content to meet you outside his walls, or for a formal audience if enough of our men remain at your back. Marrying a Frey? We can't force any of my children into that. Nor would I, but perhaps there are lesser alliances we might negotiate. We must weigh the cost versus the risk of forcing a crossing." Daenerys gave a tight nod. I will not be bullied, but if meeting with him is the price of peaceful passage, I might endure it. As for marriage, no. I have no intention of wedding any Frey. A brief silence fell. Great John Umber snorted from the back. Let's just force our way across. We have dragons, after all. Those twin castles will burn quick enough if the old weasel tries to stop us. Several lords murmured. Others shot uneasy glances at Daenerys, as though they feared she might take that suggestion. She let out a measured breath. I do not intend to conquer the Riverlands by fire, not if it can be avoided. That would turn the small folk against us and gift the Lannisters an easy story of Targaryen cruelty. We'll attempt negotiation first. Robb nodded, calmer now. Agreed. We can at least try to talk sense into the man. Once across, we can hurry to Riverrun's aid. If Frey obstructs us, we'll find another path. Or we'll take the twins by force if we have no choice, though it'll cost time and men. Thus decided, Ned dispatched a second set of envoys with carefully worded offers. Recognition of certain Frey rights, perhaps a trade agreement with White Harbor, and the presence of Daenerys for a day's audience under agreed terms of safety. Marriage alliances were politely glossed over or deferred for the future. They gave the riders instructions to be subtle yet firm, to remind Walder Frey that a dragon queen marched under the direwolf banner, and that the old man could reap enormous benefits by simply opening his gates. While they awaited the final reply, the host broke camp at Moat Cailin and began the march south through the neck. The trudging columns kicked up boggy mud that clung to boots. Men cursed the biting insects and the smell of marsh decay. The causeways wound among quagmires and scrawny trees. Here and there, the ground seemed to move as hidden creatures slithered into the water. Daenerys, not used to such terrain, found it oppressive. Yet it was said that an army marching north could easily be harassed or whittled down by hidden archers in these bogs. Now, though, the crannogmen who lived in the neck were nominally allied with House Stark. They emerged quietly at times to exchange news with Ned's outriders, confirming that no southern army lurked beyond. Their leader, Howland Reed, had not shown himself in person, but a messenger from the Reeds arrived to assure Ned of the crannogmen's support. Daenerys had barely heard of these swamp dwellers and found their stealthy presence a curious comfort. After nearly a week of slow progress, an advance rider returned with tidings from the twins. Walder Frey had agreed to let them cross, provided Daenerys Targaryen herself entered his hall for a formal parley, escorted by only a modest guard. He had backed down somewhat from demanding marriages, perhaps sensing the alliance's patience was thin. Ned, reading the parchment, pursed his lips. We can't trust him fully, but if we approach with our full strength outside his gates, it might dissuade treachery. As soon as we cross, we can occupy the far side to ensure he doesn't close the route behind us. Daenerys sighed. I will see this through then. We'll have the entire army lined up at the banks, so if he tries anything, we can respond. I'll take Ser Barristan, Yora, a handful of your men, and possibly one of the dragons, if it can be managed without incinerating the Freys on sight. She said the last part dryly, but with an undercurrent of seriousness. They pressed on, reaching the edges of the Riverlands as the land began to dry out, the bogs fading into rolling plains and farmland dotted with patches of woodland. Here, the autumn air carried a different bite, less wet cold than the north, but still chilly enough that men huddled under cloaks at night. Smoke rose from distant hamlets, some deserted from fear of raids. Stories had come of Gregor Clegane and other Lannister bannermen laying waste to villages near the Trident, but apparently they had not yet ventured this far north. At last, the day came when the twin castles loomed into view across the broad, green waters of the river. Two squat, formidable keeps faced each other on either bank, connected by an arched stone bridge. Towers rose from each fortress, bristling with arrow slits and battlements. Beyond them, the rolling farmland continued toward the heart of the Riverlands. Ned recognized the vantage from times past, though he had never much liked Walder Frey's domain. The old man's banners, two blue towers on silver gray, fluttered. The largest tower overshadowed the rest, as though announcing the arrogance of House Frey. The northern host arrayed itself along the riverbank on the near side, well out of arrow range but close enough to show their number. Tens of thousands of men and horses, a forest of spears and banners. Daenerys had her dragons circle overhead, a visible sign of power that might sway Walder Frey's caution. She spotted the watchers on the ramparts, tiny shapes in Frey livery, no doubt gaping at the black-winged shapes in the sky. A smaller group prepared to cross the bridge into the first keep for the parley. Daenerys insisted on taking Drogon, who had grown just large enough to perch on her shoulder and half her back, though it was awkward and heavy. The black dragon hissed and snapped at any soldier who came too close. Ser Barristan tried to dissuade her, fearing it might provoke Walder Frey, but she remained firm. A single dragon would discourage any attempt at betrayal. Ned selected a dozen of his best men, including Desmond, to accompany her. Ser Barristan and Jorah joined as well, along with Robb, who argued that as Ned's heir, he should be present if negotiations turned sour. Ned himself would remain on the northern bank, commanding the host. If Walder Frey dared to make Daenerys or Robb hostage, Ned could respond swiftly with the entire army, and the other two dragons, Rhaegal and Viserion, who circled overhead. The plan, though risky, was the best compromise between showing trust and maintaining strength. So Daenerys, Robb, and their party rode across the wide stone bridge, the green fork rushing beneath them in a steady current. War horns sounded from the fortress ramparts, announcing their arrival. Frey soldiers glared from behind arrow slits, crossbows at the ready, but no bolts flew. The gate opened with a slow groan. Inside the courtyard, dozens of Frey men stood in formation. Daenerys saw many younger faces among them, sons or grandsons of Walder Frey, all wearing the two-towered sigil. Her mind flicked to the rumors that Walder had fathered more children than anyone could count, spreading them across half the Riverlands. He was ancient, but his brood was large and often fractious. A steward approached, bowing in stiff courtesy. "Her Grace, Daenerys Targaryen? Lord Robb Stark? Please follow me. My lord awaits you in the main hall. We have refreshments." Robb traded a grim look with Daenerys. She noted how Drogon gripped her shoulder, scanning the courtyard with a low, rumbling growl that made the Frey guards uneasy. They led their horses to stable boys, who jumped at the dragon's hiss. Ser Barristan, Jorah, and the other northern guards fell into step around Daenerys and Robb as the steward guided them inside. The main hall of the first keep was spacious but gloomy, lit by torches that sputtered with dark smoke. Long tables filled the floor, and at the far end, upon a slightly raised platform, sat Lord Walder Frey. He was an extremely old man, thin and sallow, propped up by cushions in a carved wooden chair. A host of relatives and attendants stood around him. His skin looked papery, and his expression was hawk-like, greedy eyes flicking over his visitors. Daenerys took in the room. A handful of older Freys, presumably sons or grandsons. A few women lingered in the background, dressed in drab garments. Tension pressed like a weight against the walls. As they approached, Walder Frey made a show of peering at Daenerys. "So, the Dragon Queen herself. My eyes aren't what they used to be, but I can see that silver hair well enough. And is that a lizard on your shoulder, or a cat?" He cackled a wet, phlegmy sound. "I expected something bigger. And never mind. I'm told you've got thousands of men outside." Daenerys held herself with quiet poise. "You see Drogon, my lord, who is still growing. Beyond these walls fly his siblings, Rhaegal and Viserion. If you were to step outside, you could see them yourself." Walder's eyes narrowed. He coughed into a stained kerchief. I'd rather not. My walls are comfortable enough." "And you, boy," he said, turning his attention to Robb. "I remember your father. Polite enough for a Stark. Are you polite too?" Robb's face tightened. "Polite enough to treat with you, Lord Frey. We've come to discuss our passage across the Twins." Walder Frey sniffed. Yes, you want my bridge so you can go off to your battles in the south. Wars, kings, oh, it never ends. I should charge you all a toll that would fatten my coffers for a decade. But you've proposed something else. Let's hear it." Daenerys kept her voice level. We offered certain trade rights and recognition of your castle's importance, Lord Walder. In exchange, we ask free passage for our entire host, men, horses, supplies, and we trust you will not impede or betray us in any way. Walder glanced at the men flanking her, his watery eyes fixed on Drogon. Is that a threat, little queen? This is my domain. You have no authority here. She did not waver. It's a statement of fact. If you honor our agreement, we'll honor ours. If you betray us, you will regret it. So yes, you might call it a threat if you like. The old man's mouth twitched in something like a smile. Ho ho, so the Targaryen has claws as well as dragons. I'd expect no less from a house that once had the entire realm by its throat. So what do I get, then? He leaned forward, gripping the arms of his chair. Your letter was polite but vague. You said something about trade, about letting my second son or third son be an envoy to White Harbor. That's no guarantee of anything. I want terms, real terms. Robb spoke up. The Manderleys of White Harbor are prepared to offer you favorable docking fees for your river barges, if you expand your shipping up the White Knife. Additionally, we can affirm that in any peace settlement, the Freys shall be recognized among the principal lords of the Trident. Lady Cailin Tully, my mother, will confirm your loyalty to the Tullis is recognized. The next time there is a gathering of lords in the Riverlands, House Frey will have a seat of prominence. Walder flicked his tongue over his thin lips. Seat of prominence, The Tullis always put us last. We built the crossing that everyone needs, yet they treat us like mud on their boots. Now they come begging. And you, Targaryen, are new to these parts. Who's to say you won't turn on me once you seize the throne? Daenerys took a measured breath. I have no reason to turn on the Freys if they stand with me. I need stability in the Riverlands, not more enemies. Once the Lannisters are toppled, I'll rely on loyal houses to maintain peace. If you ally with us now, you'll reap the benefits of that peace. If you spurn us and side with the Lannisters or remain hostile, you might find yourself isolated when we prevail. Walder bared his gums in a half-smirk. When you prevail, she says, so certain. Very well. I can allow your men across, for the price you've named plus one small reassurance. His gaze slid to Robb. I know you have younger siblings, boy. I hear your sister is quite a beauty. Perhaps Sansa. Or the other one. Arya, is it? The one rumored to be a wild thing. A betrothal to one of my grandsons or great-grandsons. That would be a fine seal on our arrangement. Robb bristled, and Daenerys' eyes flashed with anger. Drogon let out a hiss that echoed in the hall, causing several Frey attendants to flinch. Robb said, That's out of the question. My sisters are not pawns. Oh, aren't they? Walder Frey rasped. Isn't that what this is all about? Marriages, alliances, children to cement them? Your father didn't think so, perhaps, but in the real world, that's how it's done. Daenerys cut in, her voice frosty. We came to you with good faith, Lord Frey. If you press too hard, you risk losing everything. Ned Stark will never consent to barter his daughters. Then what do you offer in their stead? Something to tie our houses together, or at least give me reason to trust you more than the Lannisters. I hear Tywin Lannister can be generous with gold. He might offer me even more than you can. Gold can be replaced, Daenerys said. When your keep lies in ashes, it cannot. She let a hint of fire infuse her tone, and Drogon clawed at her shoulder. I've no intention of burning the twins if we can settle this peacefully. But you ask for a hostage or a marriage bond. We will not give you a Stark daughter. Instead, we can name one of your sons a sworn shield in our ranks, or some such arrangement. That would be a symbol of your own trust. Walder Frey's lips folded in thought. He studied her. Then he shifted his attention to Robb. You see what I must endure? Threats, demands. And yet I'm expected to yield. Let me see your map, Stark. He snapped his fingers at one of his brood, who fumbled to bring forth a roll of parchment. I want to see these prospective trade routes to White Harbor. If I'm satisfied it's profitable, maybe we can skip the marriage nonsense. Too many children to keep track of as it is. Robb exhaled, trying to calm his frustration. The mood in the hall was taut. Daenerys stepped aside with him and Ser Barristan while one of the Manderly envoys unrolled a map and began discussing shipping lanes, tolls, and potential incomes for the Freys. Meanwhile, Walder Frey muttered occasional demands, coughing wetly into his kerchief. It took the better part of an hour to hammer out the details, with the old man quibbling over every silver. Eventually, Robb and the Manderly envoy arrived at a figure that made Frey's eyes gleam. Daenerys suspected that, for all his talk of marriage alliances, gold had always been his true interest. Once the terms were tentatively settled, favorable tolls, plus Walder's recognition as a key shipping partner with White Harbor, Walder Frey stroked his chin. "All right, I suppose I can grant safe passage to your army. I'll have my men raise the portcullis and open the other side of the bridge in the morning. If you do anything untoward, like loosing that dragon at my towers, I'll close it in your faces." "Understood." Daenerys managed a curt nod. "We have no intention of violence if you keep your word." Walder gave a final, rattling chuckle. "I do keep my word, Targaryen, as long as it suits me." They exchanged a few more stiff courtesies, and then Daenerys and Robb turned to leave with their retinue. The tension in the hall slowly bled away. Once outside, Daenerys let out a long breath. Robb's face still burned with indignation. "That old wretch. He would have demanded one of my sisters, as if he has the right to claim them." Daenerys adjusted Drogon, who was twitching on her shoulder, wings half flared. "We avoided that, and though he's insufferable, he's giving us the crossing. That's what we needed. We'll keep watch for treachery, but for now we can move on." They remounted and rode back across the bridge under the wary eyes of Frey crossbowmen, returning to the northern host. Ned awaited them, scanning their expressions anxiously. When Robb told him of Walder Frey's initial demand for a Stark daughter, Ned's mouth set in a grim line. The man has no shame. He listened as Daenerys explained how they swayed him with trade benefits instead. "Well, that's a relief," Ned said quietly, "though we'll remain on guard. We cross in the morning under arms." True to Walder Frey's grudging promise, the next day dawned with the gates open on both sides of the Twins Bridge, allowing the northern army to flow through like a mighty river. Frey soldiers lined the ramparts, watching in silence as thousands of men, wagons, horses, and supply carts passed under their gaze. The dragons soared overhead, occasionally drawing startled cries from the younger Freys. Walder himself did not appear, leaving instructions for his steward to ensure no rowdiness from the northerners. Ned kept the movement orderly, squadrons crossing in careful formation. Daenerys and her retinue went near the front, ensuring that if Walder Frey tried to lower the gates suddenly, they'd already be beyond. It took much of the day for the host to clear the crossing, but by sunset, the entire army had crossed the Green Fork into the Riverlands proper with minimal incident. Ned ordered a secure encampment a few miles beyond the Twins, perched on higher ground near a bend in the river. Daenerys flew overhead briefly on Drogon, who could now take her weight for short distances, though it was still unsteady, to survey the area. Men pointed up at the sky in amazement. She dismounted with a swirl of excitement and caution. Riding a not yet fully grown dragon was exhilarating but precarious. Drogon occasionally snarled or lurched mid-flight. Nonetheless, the display left an impression on the soldiers. That night, in Ned's command tent, they planned the next phase, the march toward Riverrun. Scouts confirmed that Lannister outriders and raiders under Ser Gregor Clegane plagued the area around the Red Fork, burning villages and capturing supplies. Edmure Tully and Catelyn Stark were said to be holed up in Riverrun, preparing defenses. Tywin Lannister himself might be massing forces farther south, or possibly at Harrenhal, though rumors varied. Daenerys studied the map by candlelight, her dragons dozing in a warm corner of the large pavilion. "If we push straight to Riverrun, we could smash any Lannister raiders we encounter and relieve the siege. From there, we coordinate with the Tullys to see how best to press forward. But we must be swift. The longer we delay, the more the Lannisters dig in." Ned nodded, arms folded. "Agreed. We won't stop until we reach Riverrun. Any raiders we find will scatter. I only pray we arrive before Tywin's main host encloses the castle." Robb clenched a fist on the table, glancing at the flickering candle flame. "My mother is there, father. And my grandfather, Lord Hoster, though he's said to be on his deathbed. The Lannisters won't show mercy if they sense weakness. We'll give them no chance to press that advantage," Daenerys said firmly. "We march at dawn." They did exactly that. The morning brought a slight drizzle, turning the road south into patches of mud. But the northern army pressed on, strung out in a long column. Daenerys rode near the front with Ned, Robb, and a retinue that included Greatjon Umber and Roose Bolton. Scouts scoured the countryside ahead, returning with scattered news of burned farms, fleeing peasants, and Lannister outriders who vanished at the first sight of a large force. Each day, the gloom in Ned's expression grew. He had seen war's ravages before, but for Daenerys, it was a sobering experience. The charred ruins of hamlets, ashes drifting in the wind. These were the small folk who labored to feed the realm, now caught between armies. By midday on the third day past the Twins, they encountered their first real skirmish. Scouts reported a band of Lannister men, perhaps 200, looting a riverside village. Ned gave the command to encircle them. The Great John led a swift charge from the flank, bellowing war cries, while Daenerys circled overhead on Drogon, who hissed menacingly. Robb Stark and a wedge of cavalry crashed into the Lannisters, scattering them in confusion. Daenerys watched from above, heart pounding, the wind battering her face. She felt Drogon tense, wanting to unleash flame. She allowed a short burst, driving a group of Lannisters into a panicked flight away from the huts they'd been pillaging. Men shouted that they were under dragon attack, throwing down weapons to run or diving into the shallow waters of the river. The northern cavalry cut off their retreat, capturing most and slaying those who resisted. When the fighting ended, the small village was left in sullen ruin. Smoke wafted from a handful of huts. Peasants, frightened but grateful, emerged from hiding once they saw the direwolf banners. Daenerys dismounted, still unsteady after the adrenaline rush, and helped calm a terrified woman clutching a child. The woman stared at the black-scaled dragon behind Daenerys with wide, tear-filled eyes, then at the swirl of northern soldiers. Daenerys tried to reassure her, though she had few comforting words for people whose homes were already half-burned. Ned and Robb joined the survivors, urging them to gather what they could and travel north to safety behind the army's lines, if they wished. A blacksmith with a burned hand told them the Lannisters under a knight with a lion-crested helm had ridden through just hours earlier, claiming to clear the land of traitors who defied King Joffrey. The blacksmith spat in disgust, wincing from his injury. Ned promised to see that they had enough provisions to relocate if they chose. The man's wife merely looked at Ned and Daenerys with hollow-eyed exhaustion. Seeing the scorched huts, the slain Lannister men, and the terrified peasants, Daenerys felt the familiar twist in her gut. War was never clean. She recalled how she had once dreamed of returning to Westeros in triumph, liberating the realm that had cast out House Targaryen. But this was the reality. The realm would suffer, no matter her best intentions. She took a slow breath, reminding herself that if Joffrey and the Lannisters continued unopposed, the suffering would only spread. At least here, they could try to keep the damage minimal and protect the small folk. They pressed on. More skirmishes followed over the next week, each brief and one-sided as Lannister outriders quickly discovered that tangling with the combined northern host and dragons was futile. Some retreated south, carrying warnings to Tywin or Gregor Clegane. Others surrendered. Daenerys used Drogon's flame sparingly, mostly for intimidation or to scatter foes. She did not wish to gain a reputation for burning men alive unless necessary. Her presence and the presence of the other two dragons, who soared above the marching columns, proved enough to sap Lannister morale in many cases. As they neared Riverrun, the landscape changed. Broad fields, the confluence of the Red Fork and the Tumblestone, gentle hills dotted with autumn-tinted trees. The nights grew warmer than in the neck, though a chill still lingered. Finally, from a ridge, they spotted Riverrun in the distance, perched on a triangular promontory where two rivers met. Its high, reddish walls gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Banners of House Tully, trout on a field of red and blue, fluttered from the battlements. Smoke rose from outside the walls, suggesting a camp or skirmish. Even at a distance, they could see a cluster of Lannister tents on the eastern side, though it did not appear to be a full siege camp. Possibly the Lannister forces were too scattered or insufficient in number to fully encircle the castle. Ned halted his horse, shading his eyes. It looks like the main Lannister host isn't here. These might be raiders or a partial force. We can break them easily. Robb's lips twitched in a fierce half-smile. Mother is in there, behind those walls. We'll drive off the Lannisters by sundown. Daenerys signaled Ser Barristan to gather their cavalry. We'll approach from the north, flank them. The castle defenders might sally forth to aid us if they see an army at their gate. The plan unfolded swiftly. Drums and horns sounded across the lines as the northern infantry formed ranks, with the cavalry splitting off to swing around to the Lannisters' eastern flank. Daenerys ascended onto Drogon again, though she could not remain airborne for long. Rhaegal and Viserion soared at a higher altitude, riderless for now, circling under the watchful eyes of a few Dothraki dragon handlers who had learned ways to whistle commands. As the northern columns advanced, the Lannister tents erupted in frantic activity. Sentries sounded alarms. Men scrambled to form a defensive line. Red and gold banners flickered in the wind. Within the hour, the armies clashed at the fields outside Riverrun. It was not a large-scale battle, perhaps 1,000 Lannisters at most, likely outriders and mercenaries under Gregor Clegane or another of Tywin's captains. The northern vanguard outnumbered them heavily. Daenerys watched from above as the lines met in a crash of steel and cries. Drogon roared, spitting a brief stream of flame that sent a portion of the Lannister cavalry reeling. From the castle gates of Riverrun, a column of Tully men and knights in the Blackfish sigil thundered out, rallying to join the fight. For a moment, the Lannisters tried to hold formation, but the momentum and sheer numbers of the combined Tully-Stark forces overwhelmed them. Several attempted to flee, but the northern cavalry cut off their retreat, and archers loosed volleys that thinned their ranks. Gregor Clegane was not in sight. Some said he was off in another corner of the Riverlands, or possibly with Tywin. The Lannister captain present tried to rally, shouting curses at the treacherous north, but soon fell under a barrage of sword blows from the Grachan's men. The remaining Lion bannermen either died, surrendered, or scattered. By late afternoon, the field was won, the red and gold tents trampled. Riverrun's defenders rushed forward to greet their rescuers, relief on every face. The drawbridge was lowered, and within the courtyard, Daenerys dismounted near Ned, who gave her a brief, tight smile. "Riverrun is freed," he said. "A small victory, but a vital one." Trumpets sounded from the castle walls as Lord Edmure Tully emerged, tall and red-haired, wearing battered armor. Beside him walked Caitlin Stark, eyes wide with emotion, her auburn hair pinned back under a practical veil. The moment she spotted Ned and Robb, she ran forward, ignoring decorum, and threw her arms around them. Robb embraced her fiercely, tears shining in his eyes. Ned stepped back to let them have a moment, a soft warmth in his gaze. At last, Caitlin turned to Ned, pressing a trembling hand to his chest. "You're alive," she whispered, voice thick. "All those rumors, and I feared the worst. Then the ravens said you were marching with a Targaryen." Ned took her hand gently. "It's a long tale, Cat. I'll tell you everything. But first, let me present Daenerys Targaryen, who is partly the reason I stand here free today." Caitlin turned, noticing Daenerys fully. Her expression was torn between curiosity and the old Tully wariness for anything Targaryen. But she offered a courteous nod, if somewhat stiff. "Your Grace, my husband speaks highly of your aid." Daenerys inclined her head. "Lady Stark, I am glad to see you safe. We came as quickly as we could, once we learned the Riverlands were under threat." Before more could be said, Edmure Tully approached, greeting them with hurried courtesy. He was out of breath from the fighting, a shallow cut on his cheek. "We've been harried by Lannister forces for weeks. Tywin is rumored to be gathering a larger army near Harrenhal. We've been expecting a siege. Thank the gods you arrived when you did. Ned turned to the castle gates, where Tully knights ushered the northern men inside, cheers and waves echoing in the courtyard. We should move our host into a defensible camp. Then we'll coordinate our next move. If Tywin is near Harrenhal, we need to confirm his strength. But first, let your wounded be cared for. We have supplies. Night fell over a Riverrun teeming with new allies. The battered Lannister tents had been stripped for materials. Northmen, Tully men, and even a few of Daenerys's Dothraki mingled warily in the outer wards. Daenerys and Ned, along with their key advisors, gathered in the great hall that soared above the confluence of the rivers. A roaring hearth cast long shadows. Sentries guarded the doors, the Tully fish sigils bright in the torchlight. Cailin sat at Ned's side, occasionally glancing at Daenerys with cautious curiosity. Edmure Tully stood by a table laden with maps, conferring with Robb and Ser Barristan. Others, Great John Umber, Roose Bolton, Lady Meage Mormont, were there as well, forming a ring of watchers. The mood was one of tempered victory, overshadowed by the knowledge that Tywin's main host still lay out of reach. Caitlyn's eyes kept straying to Daenerys's dragons, which perched on an indoor ledge above the hearth, chuffing and flicking their tails. The largest, Drogon, had dozed off, but Regal occasionally hissed if anyone drew too near. Finally, as the conversation turned to war logistics, Cailin leaned quietly to Ned and murmured, "Those creatures, are they truly under her control?" Ned gave a small nod. "Mostly. They have minds of their own, but she can guide them, especially Drogon. They're the reason the Lannisters have not dared to march a large army openly against us yet. They fear Dragonfire, Cat, and rightly so." She pressed her lips together. "I see. We have lost so much to Targaryen kings in the past, Ned. I still remember stories of your father." She cut herself short, shaking her head. "But if she saved you from the Lannisters, I owe her gratitude." Ned squeezed her hand. "I understand your misgivings. I had them too. But Daenerys is not Aerys. She wants to rule more justly than that. We have a chance to end Lannister tyranny with minimal bloodshed, if the realm rallies." Across the hall, Edmure Tully cleared his throat. "Lord Stark, your grace, if I may have your attention. Scouts confirm that Tywin Lannister is indeed at Harrenhal with a sizable force. Some say 20,000 men or more. He's summoned bannermen from the Westerlands, and we suspect the mountain that rides Gregor Clegane is also with him. Harrenhal is a formidable fortress, though half-cursed, they say. A direct assault might be costly. We could bypass it, but then Tywin might strike our rear if we move on King's Landing." Robb frowned. "What if we lure Tywin north, away from Harrenhal, then strike the castle while it's under-defended? Or else force him into a field battle on our terms?" Roose Bolton's voice, quiet and precise, cut in. "Harrenhal is ruinous but still offers strong walls. We risk a long siege which could buy the Lannisters time to reinforce from the west. Alternatively, we might attempt to draw Tywin into the open. But is that wise, if his numbers match ours?" Daenerys ran a hand over Drogon's scaly back. The dragon stirred, opening a lazy red eye. "My dragons give us an advantage in open battle. The threat of Dragonfire alone might break Tywin's lines. But I do not wish to immolate thousands if it can be avoided. Nor do I want to see them cower behind the walls of Harrenhal for months. Perhaps we can combine the threat of an attack on Harrenhal with a feint, forcing him to sally out to protect something he values, like the supply lines from the Westerlands." Ned's expression turned thoughtful. "We can also consider alliances. The Riverlands are with us, but what of the Vale, the Stormlands, the Reach? Renly's claim draws the Tyrells. If they march on King's Landing from the south, Tywin might be forced to withdraw from Harrenhal to defend the capital." Cailin interjected, "My sister, Lisa Arryn, remains stubborn in the Vale. I doubt she'll march her knights to war. She clings to the Eyrie, claiming neutrality for her son's sake." She shook her head in frustration. Edmure shrugged. "The Tyrells and Renly might be your best hope to divert the Lannisters. but they might refuse to side with a Targaryen if they still hold old grudges from Robert's rebellion. Daenerys cast her gaze across the gathered lords. Then perhaps I should send envoys to Renly. He aims to be king, but if he sees our strength, maybe he'll prefer to ally with us against Joffrey. Stannis also claims the throne, though he's rumored to be on Dragonstone. It's a tangled situation. A murmur of agreement spread. Ned rubbed his beard, which was flecked with more gray than ever. We must move carefully, for now Harrenhal looms. Tywin is a cunning commander. Let us fortify Riverrun, secure the Riverlands, and begin sending out envoys. We can plan an offensive if the opportunity arises. Meanwhile, I suggest we continue smaller strikes against Lannister outposts, whittling away his strength. The meeting concluded with a rough consensus to hold Riverrun as a bastion while they scouted Tywin's dispositions. Daenerys and Ned also agreed to dispatch riders to Renly Baratheon, testing his willingness to coordinate. In the days that followed, the northern host spread through the nearby countryside, liberating or securing small towns once harassed by Lannister raiders. The presence of the dragons stoked a mixture of terror and awe among the peasants. Some hailed Daenerys as a savior from the Lion Devils, while others looked at her as a new potential tyrant. She tried her best to reassure them, conscious of how quickly rumors could twist events. Within Riverrun's stone walls, Daenerys spent time speaking with Cailin, who remained guarded but polite. They shared a few quiet moments on a balcony overlooking the river's confluence, watching the waters churn below. Cailin asked about the events that led Daenerys to save Ned. Daenerys recounted her journey across Essos, the death of her brother Viserys, the hatching of the dragons, and how Ned had appeared in Pentos, fleeing King's Landing. She spoke of the vow she'd made to rule differently than her father, though she felt the doubts in Caitlin's gaze. Still, there was a softness in Caitlin's eyes when she spoke of how Ned had always valued honor and family, how fiercely he loved his children. "If he trusts you," she said softly, "then I will try to do the same. Our realm has too much bloodshed already." Daenerys nodded. "We share that wish, Lady Stark." Elsewhere in the castle, Ned reconnected with Cailin more fully, confiding the guilt and burdens he carried, how close he had come to losing Sansa and Arya in King's Landing and across the sea. Robb, meanwhile, assumed more command responsibilities, riding out with scouting parties and forging bonds with the Tully Knights. The more time Daenerys spent among the Starks and Tullis, the more she saw the deep family loyalties that bound them, a stark contrast to the intrigue-ridden courts of Essos or King's Landing. She felt a pang, recalling how she had never truly known family besides her brother, who had tormented her. Here, among these people, she sensed a unity that gave them strength. A week passed with no direct move by Tywin. Ravens arrived daily with conflicting news. Some said Tywin had ridden west to answer a brewing threat from Renly's new alliance. Others claimed he remained at Harrenhal, gathering more forces. No large Lannister army approached Riverrun. This lull gave Daenerys, Ned, and the others time to rebuild the war-torn region. They distributed grain from the north, repaired local fortifications, and hunted down leftover bands of brigands. The small folk gradually emerged from hiding, relief dawning in their eyes when they realized that the Dragonwolf host kept the peace rather than pillaging. Daenerys felt a quiet pride in that, though she knew the true war had yet to begin. On the 8th day, a battered group of riders appeared at Riverrun's gates, carrying Renly Baratheon's stag banner quartered with the Tyrell Rose. They announced themselves as envoys from King Renly. Ned received them in the presence of Daenerys and Edmure Tully. The lead envoy, a tall knight with a flamboyant crest, delivered Renly's letter sealed with green wax. Ned broke it, scanning quickly, his expression unreadable. Then he offered it to Daenerys. She read, "To Lord Eddard Stark, once Hand of the King, and to Daenerys Targaryen, styling herself rightful heir of the Iron Throne. Renly Baratheon, by the grace of the Seven, King of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, etc., greets you. Word has reached me of your host in the Riverlands and your efforts against Joffrey's false reign. I would parley with you regarding our mutual interest in dethroning the Lannister pretender. I hold the support of House Tyrell and many southern lords. Together, we may bring an end to the vile incest and cruelty in King's Landing. I invite you to treat with me on neutral ground near Bitterbridge. Let us find common cause in this time of chaos. Signed, Renly of House Baratheon, the first of his name. Daenerys looked at Ned. He calls himself king as well. Are we to treat him as such? Ned's mouth pressed thin. Renly claims the crown he has no legal right to, since Stannis is Robert's elder brother. But legalities matter little in war, especially if the Tyrells back him. If he has an army in the Reach, it could rival ours in numbers. Perhaps an alliance is possible, if he's willing to recognize your claim. Or at least join forces to unseat Joffrey. Edmure Tully tapped his chin. Bitterbridge is some distance south, along the Rose Road. It's on the way to King's Landing if we march that route, but we'd be venturing into a region closer to Renly's base. Are we prepared to risk that? Daenerys handed the letter back. I will not kneel to Renly Baratheon. If we treat with him, it must be as equals. He styles himself a king, but so do I, or will. I have the blood of House Targaryen, the dragons, and the North behind me. If he's willing to coordinate, perhaps we can put aside our competing titles until Joffrey is deposed. Then let the realm decide, or let us come to an agreement. Ned agreed. Renly might prefer you as an ally rather than an enemy. The Tyrells might recall the devastation your ancestors once wrought. They would not relish facing dragons in open battle. Still, we must be wary of traps. If Renly or the Tyrells think they can capture you, Daenerys thought of Walder Frey's attempts and scowled. We'll bring dragons, as we always do. That will discourage betrayals. But we cannot commit our entire force to a march on Bitterbridge while Tywin lurks near Harrenhal. We should leave a strong garrison in the Riverlands to contain the Lannisters. They debated for hours, eventually resolving that Daenerys would indeed travel south for a parley with Renly, but with a sizable escort of Northern and Tully troops. Ned would remain behind to guard Riverrun and keep Tywin in check, though he would send Robb as part of Daenerys' entourage. This arrangement balanced the need to protect their current position with the opportunity to secure a powerful ally in the Reach. Word was promptly sent back to Renly's envoys, accepting the invitation but insisting on terms to ensure Daenerys' safety. The envoys departed, apparently satisfied, bearing an agreed-upon time and location for the parley. Ned spent a quiet evening alone with Daenerys in Riverrun Solar, going over final details before her departure. The windows overlooked the starlit rivers. Outside, soldiers patrolled the walls, the hush of night broken by the faint clank of arms. Daenerys wore a simple gown of dark blue wool, more practical for the river chill than the silks of Essos. Ned set aside a half-finished letter to his older children in Winterfell. He paused to rub his temples. This war grows more complicated by the day, he said. You'll have to weigh Renly's demands carefully. He might want your open support of his kingship. If you refuse, he could turn the Tyrells against us. On the other hand, if you yield too much, the North might see it as betrayal of your claim. Daenerys clasped her hands. I wish there were a simpler path, but I cannot yield my birthright, nor can I fight every claimant at once. Perhaps we can offer to join forces only until Joffrey is cast down. Then let the realm's great council decide who should sit the throne. I'm confident my claim is the strongest, but if Renly is determined to call himself king... She trailed off, exhaling. Ned studied her with a somber gaze. If you show him strength, but also a willingness to end Lannister rule quickly, it may sway him. He might see advantage in your dragons. Let's hope it doesn't come to swords at the parley. She managed a faint smile. You and I have weathered parley with Walder Frey and come out intact. Renly should be more reasonable. Ned gave a small, dry chuckle. One can hope. I will remain here, in case Tywin emerges from Harrenhal. Keep Robb safe. And if the Tyrells or Renly turn treacherous, use your dragons freely. The next day, Daenerys made ready to ride south, leaving roughly half the northern host to garrison Riverrun. She departed with around 6,000 men, cavalry, some archers, and a corps of knights from the Mormonts, Umbers, and Tully retinues. Robb Stark rode at her side as the commander of the northern cavalry, proud yet anxious. Ser Barristan Selmy and Jorah Mormont accompanied them, as did Grey Wind, Robb's direwolf, who prowled the flanks in watchful silence. Daenerys's dragons soared overhead, Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, causing many in Riverrun to line the battlements just to watch them fade into the southern sky. Cailin stood with Ned on the drawbridge, watching the column wind away. "We keep sending our children off to war," she murmured, voice tinged with sorrow. "Robb, so young." Ned placed a hand on her shoulder. "He's grown, and he has a good head on his shoulders. Daenerys is no fool either. If all goes well, this parley might bring us a step closer to peace, or at least a decisive stand against Joffrey." Cailin nodded, though tears shone in her eyes. "May the gods protect them, all of them." So began Daenerys' journey south through the Riverlands, guided by lords loyal to House Tully. They passed ravaged fields, more small hamlets in need of relief, and a few scattered Lannister stragglers who fled at the sight of dragons. The presence of Robb's direwolf, Grey Wind, further unnerved any would-be raiders. Each evening, the host camped in whatever secure ground they could find, lighting fires that glimmered for miles across the open plains. Daenerys maintained a rotating guard for the dragons, ensuring no accidents or sabotage. Riding Drogon had become easier with practice, though he was still not large enough for extended flights carrying her. Sometimes she soared ahead to scout the roads, scanning for signs of larger enemy forces. She began to understand the land from a dragon's eye view. Meandering rivers, patchwork farms, dense stands of trees. It was exhilarating, a vantage none but a Targaryen had enjoyed for generations. About a week into the march, the Riverlands bled into the territory near the Blackwater Rush. They turned southwest, heading for the roads leading to Bitterbridge. The heat grew noticeable, especially after the crisp northern air. Thick forests gave way to gentle hills of farmland. From passing peasants or merchant caravans, they heard more rumors of Renly's grand alliance with the Tyrells. Some travelers spoke of how Margaery Tyrell had become Renly's queen in a lavish ceremony at Highgarden. Others claimed Stannis lurked in the east, performing dark rites with a red priestess. Daenerys listened with half a mind, focusing on her immediate goals. The war had become a tangled web of claimants, each threatening to tear the realm further. If she could broker an understanding with Renly, perhaps they could unite long enough to dislodge the Lannisters. Afterward, well, she would face that future when it came. Finally, as they neared the designated meeting place, Renly's outriders appeared, wearing colorful half-cloaks of green and gold. They signaled that the parley site lay just a few miles ahead, a broad meadow near a bend in the Mander. Daenerys directed her men to set up a perimeter, mindful of possible treachery. Robb accompanied her with a cavalry screen, while Ser Barristan went ahead to assess the security. The outriders insisted that Renly awaited them with a personal guard, no more than a few hundred men, to ensure neutrality. They glimpsed bright, fluttering banners in the distance. Renly's golden stag on a green field, entwined with the Tyrell rose. Daenerys paused at the crest of a low hill. She could see a wide clearing near the river, dotted with tents of bright Tyrell colors, greens, golds, and blooming roses in embroidered patterns. Renly's standard was prominent, a crowned stag prancing. Soldiers in polished armor lined the perimeter, forming an honor guard. The air smelled of grass and flowing water. Across from them, the northern ranks formed up, fanning out to make sure no hidden forces lurked. It was an uneasy calm, a hush before two large armies that might either join or clash. She turned to Robb, who sat astride a tall gray stallion. His face showed determination tempered by nervous energy. "Stay close. We'll ride forward with a small escort. The dragons can circle overhead for intimidation, but let's not provoke a fight. If Renly means treachery, he'll see our full strength, and we'll respond in kind." Robb gave a curt nod. "Understood. We won't let them box us in." They advanced into the meadow, Daenerys at the lead, riding Drogon's swaying black shape. He could manage a slow glide at low altitude, just enough to make a dramatic entrance. The other two dragons soared higher, watchful, A hush spread over Renly's assembly as the Targaryen queen dropped to the grass in a swirl of dust, Drogon roaring once to announce himself. Robb and a handful of Stark knights rode in behind, forming a protective half-circle. Renly Baratheon emerged from the cluster of noblemen near a colorful pavilion. He wore a gleaming breastplate with the crowned stag etched in gold, a green cloak pinned at one shoulder. Beside him stood Margaery Tyrell, slim and poised, garbed in a gown of pale green, a small golden crown resting upon her rich brown hair. Around them gathered notable figures of the Reach. Lord Mace Tyrell, corpulent and smiling. Ser Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, resplendent in polished armor, and other lords or knights from houses Rowan, Tarly, and Oakhart. Daenerys sensed the swirl of eyes upon her. Some awed, some wary, some disbelieving. Drogon hissed low, smoke curling from his jaws. Renly stepped forward with a grand, theatrical smile. "Princess Daenerys Targaryen, I presume, or shall I say queen?" He cast a wry glance at her dragons. "I must say, your arrival is more dramatic than I expected." Daenerys inclined her head, refusing to be drawn into banter. "Lord Renly, I received your summons and I have come. Have you gathered here to treat me as an equal, or do you insist upon calling yourself the sole king of Westeros?" Margaery Tyrell studied Daenerys with a calm, calculating gaze, then looked at Renly. He chuckled lightly. "Oh, I see you're not one for pleasantries, fair queen. Let me speak plainly. King Joffrey is a bastard born of incest, we can agree on that. He has no right to the throne. I have declared myself king of the 7 kingdoms with the backing of Highgarden, Storm's End, and many more. Stannis might object, but he has fewer supporters. Now you come claiming your father's throne, with the North at your side. The question is, do we fight each other, or do we unite against the Lannisters first?" Daenerys kept her posture straight, Drogon twitching at her side. "I have no desire to waste lives battling you while Cersei and Joffrey remain in power. We can join forces to oust them, but I will not bend the knee to you, Renly. If we succeed, we can let the realm decide how to choose its next monarch, whether by great council, by the sword, or by recognition of my birthright. I have the blood of Aegon the Conqueror, and the dragons are returned." Renly's eyes flicked to Drogon, a hint of unease crossing his face despite his confident smile. "Yes, indeed, the dragons. It seems you have a potent advantage there. I've heard tales. The Tyrells and I field the largest army in Westeros, so we have advantage in numbers. Why not combine those strengths? Or so you propose?" Lord Mace Tyrell, standing near, boomed with forced joviality. "My dear daughter Margaery is already queen. We do not seek another queen, but perhaps we can be practical. The Lannisters must be toppled. Let that be our shared aim." Margaery's serene voice chimed in. "We should not let old grudges or uncertain claims tear us apart. The small folk suffer under the Lannisters. Let us end their tyranny." Daenerys regarded Margaery carefully. She sensed a keen intelligence beneath that gentle exterior. "I propose an alliance of arms against Joffrey. Once King's Landing is taken, we will see how the realm responds. If you cling to your crown, Renly, I will cling to mine, and we can settle it in a manner the realm finds acceptable, without turning our armies upon each other prematurely. But let us be clear, I will not yield. If you try to force me or my allies to kneel, we will resist, and dragons do not yield lightly." Renly cast a quick look at Ser Loras, who stood with a guarded expression. Then he turned back, still wearing that polished smile. "That's quite the stance, my lady, but I'm nothing if not reasonable. Very well. Let us set aside the question of who sits the throne in the end. Together we bring down Joffrey and the Lannisters. Then, if it must come to it, we can discuss how the final seat of power is determined. I suspect the realm might prefer me, but we'll see. In the meantime, what do you want from me?" Daenerys answered without hesitation. "Your banners, your knights. Join our forces in a coordinated attack on King's Landing or wherever Joffrey's supporters stand. We strike swiftly, limit the bloodshed, remove the false king from the throne, and place the city under joint occupation until the matter of succession is resolved." Renly considered, stroking his neatly trimmed beard. A joint occupation of the capital. That implies you expect me to let Targaryen banners fly in the Red Keep. If we fight side by side, Daenerys said, that is the only fair arrangement. He shrugged, apparently unoffended. If it helps end the Lannisters, so be it. The Tyrells and I have no love for Joffrey now. The boy has proven too unstable and cruel. Cersei's manipulations are vile. We plan to march on King's Landing from the south soon, but if we coordinate with you from the north, Joffrey will have nowhere to run. Tywin might attempt to save him from Harrenhal, but with the north and the Riverlands pressing him, he'll be trapped as well. Mace Tyrell cleared his throat. We must ensure that the city does not starve. The Tyrells supply much of King's Landing's grain. If we cut off those supplies, the city will surrender faster, but the small folk will starve. We want to avoid slaughter if we aim to rule after. A planned blockade might suffice. Daenerys thought of the chaos that might descend on the capital. We can plan carefully. The main point is that we must not become each other's enemies before the Lannisters are defeated. Robb Stark spoke up for the first time, voice steady. The North stands behind Daenerys. We have no desire to bend the knee to a Southern king. But if we set that aside, we can indeed crush the Lannisters swiftly. They've haunted the realm long enough. Renly measured Robb with a curious glint in his eye. You look a great deal like your father, Eddard. He was always a man of principle. I trust you've inherited that. He exhaled. Then let us have peace, at least until the Lannister threat is ended. My lords, we shall draft a formal pact confirming this alliance. In the meantime, I'll send word to rally my forces near King's Landing. Will you do the same from the Riverlands? Daenerys and Robb exchanged a nod. We will. We hold Riverrun and the support of House Tully. Tywin Lannister still threatens from Harrenhal, but if you move swiftly from the south, he'll be forced to defend King's Landing. That's when we can close in. Attention seemed to lift in the meadow. Margaery Tyrell offered a gracious smile, stepping forward to greet Daenerys more cordially. You must be weary from your travels, Your Grace. We have refreshments prepared in our pavilion, if you care to join us. Let us sign this pact, break bread, and show the realm that we can unite in the face of Lannister tyranny. Daenerys glanced at Drogon, who rumbled. She stroked his neck. Very well, but do not begrudge my men if they remain watchful. Trust, once broken in Westeros, is not easily mended. Renly laughed lightly. Nor in any land, I suspect. But rest assured, we want no quarrel with dragons tonight. Thus they entered the makeshift court of Renly Baratheon. Soldiers wearing roses and golden stags parted to let them pass. The pavilion was grand, decorated with garlands of late summer flowers and silken curtains embroidered with stags, roses, and the occasional flaming heart of some allied house. Servants poured wine into silver cups, and a feast of spiced meats, fresh bread, and fruits awaited on long tables. Outside, the armies eyed each other warily, but no swords were drawn. Daenerys sat with Renly, Margaery, Robb, and various lords to outline the rough shape of their alliance. Ser Barristan and Jorah lingered close at hand, prepared to defend her if needed. There, beneath a canopy of green and gold, Daenerys Targaryen extended her hand to Renly Baratheon, each calling the other an ally in the coming storm. They drafted the pact swiftly. A mutual non-aggression agreement, cooperation against Joffrey and the Lannisters, a shared vow to refrain from claiming exclusive rights to the Iron Throne until after the war's conclusion, at which point a Great Council or some other arrangement would decide the matter. Mace Tyrell added conditions about the city's supplies and the recognition of House Tyrell's domain in the Reach. Robb insisted on the North's autonomy. Whether or not it remained under the Iron Throne in the final arrangement was left vague, intentionally so. By the time the terms were read aloud and sealed with wax, the first stars were appearing in the sky outside. Daenerys could scarcely believe it. She had come from across the sea, forging alliances with the Starks and Tullis, and now with half the southern lords through Renly Baratheon. All that remained was to see if their coalition could truly topple Joffrey, Cersei, and Tywin. Renly raised a goblet of wine, the flicker of torchlight dancing on his polished armor. "To our alliance," he proclaimed. "May it spare the realm further bloodshed and deliver us all from the Lannisters' cruelty." Daenerys lifted her cup as well, though her thoughts hovered on the possibility that once the Lannisters were gone, these new allies could become her greatest foes. She sipped the wine, sweet and aromatic, and forced a small smile. "To our alliance," she said, "and to the realm's salvation." A cheer rose among the assembled nobles, though it was tinged with caution. Outside, dragons still circled, and the men of the Reach and the North stared at each other with uneasy curiosity. The real test would come when they faced Tywin's armies, or when King's Landing saw two claimants uniting to end the false reign of Joffrey. For now, Daenerys allowed herself a moment of relief. Progress, however tenuous, had been made. That night, after the feasting had subsided, Daenerys emerged from the pavilion into the cool air. Torches lit the meadow, where men gathered around campfires, some singing, others sharpening blades. Drogon followed her, tail lashing as he sniffed the scents of rose petals and cooked meat. She gazed up at the stars. Beyond them, the black silhouettes of Rhaegal and Viserion glided, occasionally spitting a flicker of flame in playful arcs. The flicker reminded her of the vow she had made to Ned in Essos, to rule more gently than her father had. Yet every day she touched the edges of violence, forging alliances through threat of dragonfire. She wondered if she could ever break free of that cycle completely, or if the realm itself demanded a show of strength to bring peace. Soft footsteps approached. Turning, she saw Robb Stark looking pensive. He bowed slightly, still getting used to treating her as a queen in public. "Your Grace, I just wanted to say we did well today, better than I expected. Renly's men seemed ready to fight, but we found a common cause." Daenerys nodded, giving him a faint smile. "Yes, let's hope it lasts. If Tywin moves, we'll need Renly's assistance, and the Tyrells to press King's Landing." "Are you all right, Robb?" He exhaled. "As all right as one can be in a war zone. My mother is safe in Riverrun. My father is forging alliances, and my sisters, well, I wish they were safe in Winterfell, but at least they're not in King's Landing. I never asked for any of this, you know? But I suppose none of us did." She rested a hand on Drogon's flank, feeling the steady rumble of his breathing. "None of us asked for war. Sometimes I think the Seven Kingdoms were too large for peace to ever last. But if we can remove the Lannisters and stand together, maybe we can build a new order. The question is what that order will look like." Robb gazed across the campfires, eyes distant. "Indeed, the men sing songs about how a Targaryen came to the north, how House Stark bowed to dragons. They make it sound romantic. In truth, it's a tapestry of bargains and caution. Still, I'm glad you're here, Your Grace. My father speaks highly of your honor." Daenerys felt a small warmth. "He has shown me every courtesy, and more. I owe him much. If the realm finds peace, it will be partly his doing." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in thought. Then Robb excused himself to check on the northern cavalry. Daenerys lingered, gazing at the sky. She wondered what new storms would break upon them once word spread that Renly Baratheon and Daenerys Targaryen had joined forces against Joffrey. Would Tywin hunker down at Harrenhal, or would he rush to protect King's Landing? Would Cersei attempt some desperate ploy? The alliances she had painstakingly built, first with the North, now with Renly, were all balancing on the edge of a knife. One betrayal and the realm would plunge into deeper chaos. For now, though, she had done what she set out to do in leaving Riverrun, expand the coalition. She was one step closer to dethroning Joffrey, one step closer to claiming the seat that had been House Targaryen's for centuries. Yet her father's ghost lingered in her mind, a reminder of how absolute power could corrupt. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling Drogon's warmth. If she ever claimed the throne, she vowed, she would not be another tyrant. She repeated that promise like a mantra, hoping it would guide her when the final reckoning came. At dawn, the new allies parted ways. Renly would marshal the Tyrell forces fully, planning to advance on King's Landing from the south. Daenerys and Robb would return north to fortify their position in the Riverlands, coordinating a two-pronged strike once they were sure Tywin could not outmaneuver them. Before leaving, Renly extended a hand to Daenerys, wearing a confident grin. "Until we meet again on the field of victory, fair queen. May the Seven smile upon us both." Daenerys took his hand briefly. "May we end Joffrey's cruelty swiftly." With that, she mounted Drogon in a short, dramatic takeoff, while the northern cavalry formed columns behind Robb. They rode back into the Riverlands, hearts pounding with the knowledge that the final moves of this war approached. Soon, the realm would see the largest convergence of armies in living memory. Dragons from the north, Tyrell roses from the south, Baratheons, Tullys, and Starks united in a single cause. And in the heart of King's Landing stood Joffrey Baratheon, false king, with Cersei pulling strings, and the cunning Tywin Lannister determined to maintain his family's dominion. Every league they covered on the road back to Riverrun, Daenerys felt that mounting sense of destiny. She was no longer an exiled princess in Pentos, no longer a frightened girl hiding from assassins. She led a fearsome host, carried by her dragon's wings, forging alliances with the mightiest houses of the realm. Yet she knew the cost. Bloodshed loomed. She resolved to meet it on her terms, and to show mercy whenever possible. It was all she could do to ensure Westeros would not simply swap one tyrant for another. As the battered towers of Riverrun came into view once more, Daenerys tried to calm her racing thoughts and focus on the immediate tasks. Ned Stark awaited them with news, no doubt. Tywin might have moved. The next weeks would decide whether their fragile alliances would hold or splinter. She clung to the promise of a realm delivered from the Lannister yoke, a realm where the North and the South, Targaryens and Starks, could stand side by side in something close to peace. She landed Drogon in the courtyard to cheers from the Tully and Northern soldiers. Robb's direwolf bounded ahead, sniffing the air. Ned, Cailin, and Edmure Tully hurried forward, concern mingled with curiosity on their faces. Daenerys dismounted, her legs stiff, her cloak snapping in the breeze. Ned approached, noting her expression. "You've returned sooner than I anticipated, Your Grace. Did the parley go well?" Daenerys nodded, summoning a confident smile. "Renly has joined us against Joffrey. We have an alliance, for now." A spark of hope lit Ned's gray eyes. "Then perhaps the realm stands a chance to end this war quickly. Come, let us speak inside. Tywin Lannister won't wait for us to settle matters politely." She followed him, exhaustion tugging at her bones, but determination burning in her heart. One phase of the struggle was complete, another was just beginning. She took one last look at the men cheering in the courtyard, the battered banners of House Tully and House Stark, her dragons perched on the ramparts. She exhaled and whispered inwardly, "We will bring down the Lannisters, and we will forge a new dawn for Westeros." And so, in the halls of Riverrun, beneath the watchful eyes of her dragons and the ancient ghosts of past wars, Daenerys Targaryen braced herself for the final trials yet to come, hopeful that this fragile new alliance would hold long enough to crack the iron hold of House Lannister, and that once they succeeded, she could guide the realm into a kinder, fairer era than any it had yet known. Only time would reveal whether her vow, shared by Ned Stark and those who walked this razor's edge of war, could truly reshape the destiny of the Seven Kingdoms. They gathered once more in Riverrun's great hall that night, the wind howling against the castle walls. Outside, the rivers churned, dark under the moonlight. Fires burned low in the hearths, and servants rushed to lay fresh logs. The banners of House Tully swayed in the draft, a leaping trout on red and blue, side by side with the direwolf of Stark, and newly hung, a banner combining the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen with the wolf of the north, a symbol of the alliance that had shocked the realm. Daenerys stood near the dais, rubbing her arms against the chill, though she wore a thick cloak of gray fur. Beside her, Ned Stark and Robb pored over newly delivered messages, their faces cast in firelit shadows. Cailin observed from the side, hands folded. Edmure Tully paced restlessly, betraying his own blend of worry and excitement. "We have no time to spare," Ned said, glancing up at Daenerys. "Renly's force is mustering in the south, and we've had word from his outriders that they've begun to march. They'll aim to encircle King's Landing from the Rose Road. Tywin, however, is gathering men around Harrenhal. Some reports say he's made deals with mercenaries from Essos, others that he's summoned bannermen from the Westerlands to rejoin him. If we allow him to remain unchallenged, he could strike our flank once we commit to marching on the capital. Robb's gloved fingers tapped the map. It's much as we anticipated. King's Landing is less than 2 weeks away if we push hard, but Harrenhal is only somewhat off our direct route. We could try to bypass it, but Tywin's cavalry might ride out behind us, pin us between them and the city's defenses. On the other hand, if we waste time laying siege to Harrenhal, we might lose any advantage of coordinating with Renly. Daenerys let out a slow breath. Perhaps we can feign a move toward Harrenhal, see if Tywin sallies to meet us in open battle. If he refuses to leave his fortress, we can try to starve him of supplies or slip around him. But we must keep in close communication with Renly. A single misstep and the Lannisters' coup. LD devour us piecemeal. Edmure spoke up, arms folded. Riverrun can raise more men if we had a fortnight. But winter is looming, and the small folk are fearful. I think we must rely on what we have now, maybe 20,000 total once the stragglers arrive from the north. Renly claims to have near 40,000 with the Tyrells, though that number sounds inflated. Even if he only has 30,000, that's a strong host. Combined, we outnumber Tywin. Caitlyn's gaze flicked from the map to Ned. You said you would write to Stannis as well. Any word from Dragonstone? She asked quietly. Ned shook his head. None yet. I doubt Stannis will answer swiftly, if at all. He believes himself the rightful Baratheon heir. Renly's coup offends him, and the presence of Daenerys Targaryen might anger him further, for I recall how he and Robert once pledged to exterminate the Targaryen line. I suspect Stannis remains entrenched at Dragonstone, waiting for some advantage. Daenerys felt a pulse of old anxiety. If Stannis decides to oppose us, we'll contend with him as well. But for now, Joffrey and Tywin remain our greatest threat. If we can unseat Joffrey quickly, the realm might rally to whichever side can restore peace. I only hope it does not come to slaughter across every field and city. They spoke long into the night, reviewing the disposition of forces. By the time they finished, the flames in the hearth were low embers, and the hall was quiet save for the soft shuffle of servants clearing cups. Outside the window, night pressed against the glass. Each of them felt the weight of imminent war, the choices narrowing with each passing day. Finally, Ned waved them off to rest. Get what sleep you can, he told Daenerys. We'll need to depart soon, no more than 3 days. Our scouts near Harrenhal must return with precise intel on Tywin's numbers. Then we decide if we strike there or head for the capital. Daenerys offered a tired nod. Robb guided her from the hall, murmuring his farewells. Together, they passed along torchlit corridors to the wing of Riverrun set aside for their allies. Daenerys found her chamber, a modest stone room warmed by a brazier, and let the door close behind her. Even in her exhaustion, she couldn't immediately sleep. She shed her cloak, moving to where her dragons dozed near the hearth. Drogon opened a lazy, red eye at her approach, then flicked his tail and nestled back into warm coals that the servants had set. Watching them, Daenerys wondered again if she was forging a better future or only repeating the cycle. Dragons, conquest, fire, and blood. She sank onto the edge of the small bed, the cold seep of stone beneath the mattress. Eventually, she slept, dreaming of black wings and rising flames over a city with red walls. Dawn brought new tidings. A pair of outriders arrived, cloaked in mud and sweat, demanding audience. Daenerys, Ned, and the others met them in the castle yard, the pale morning light slanting across the fortress walls. The riders confirmed Tywin's presence at Harrenhal with a host rumored to be near 20,000 strong, possibly more. Additional forces from the Westerlands were expected daily. King's Landing, meanwhile, braced for siege. Joffrey had begun fortifying the city walls, and Cersei had commanded the city watch to conscript peasants for the defense. Refugees streamed out of the Crownlands, carrying stories of Joffrey's cruelty. executions for any who spoke ill of the crown, or were even suspected of northern sympathies. Daenerys's jaw set. Then we march in 3 days at the latest. Let Tywin sit in that cursed ruin. If he stays put, we'll bypass him and join with Renly. If he follows, we confront him in open battle. The dragons will give us the edge. They set about final preparations with urgent haste. Supplies had to be inventoried, wagons loaded, banners mustered. Every courtyard of Riverrun rang with the clamor of blacksmiths hammering last-minute repairs to mail and swords. Horses stomped and neighed, uneasy in the crowded stables. Northern men stood around campfires outside the gates, wrapping their furs tight even in the milder climate of the Riverlands. Tully knights trained in the practice yard, their salmon and trout sigils bright. The talk in the wards was all of war and dragons, alliances and betrayals. Some worried about Stannis or the Greyjoys. Others whispered that a quick thrust at King's Landing would end the war in weeks. Daenerys knew that victory seldom came so easily. On the second day, she climbed to Riverrun's highest battlements to look out over the confluence of the Red Fork and the Tumblestone. The water rushed bright under the midday sun. The wind tugged at her silver hair, braided tight against the breeze. Drogon perched on the stone parapet beside her, wings partially unfurled. He had grown heavier in recent weeks, so that her shoulders ached if she kept him perched for too long. Far below, soldiers bustled. She could pick out Ned's tall figure near the gates, speaking to Edmure and several knights. On an adjacent rampart, Robb stood with Great John Umber, the big man's booming laughter carrying faintly on the breeze. For a moment, she let herself envision the days after the war, a realm no longer strangled by the Lannisters. If Joffrey and Cersei were removed, if the houses accepted her claim, perhaps the bloodshed could cease. But she sensed the traps ahead. Renly's refusal to relinquish his own crown, Stannis' unwavering sense of right, and the old hatreds that might surface once the immediate threat was gone. Sighing, she stroked Drogon's neck and retreated down the stairs. That evening, Cailin invited Daenerys to share a private supper in a small solar overlooking the courtyard. Daenerys hesitated but accepted, hoping to further mend any lingering distrust. The solar was cozy, with thick drapes to block the chill. A table had been set with fresh bread, a savory stew, and a pitcher of wine. Cailin waited, hands folded in her lap, posture upright as always. She offered a tentative smile when Daenerys entered. "Your Grace," Cailin said formally. "Thank you for coming." Daenerys bowed her head in acknowledgement. "Lady Stark, thank you for the invitation. And please call me Daenerys if you wish. We have been through enough together to forego such formalities." Cailin gave a small nod, though her expression remained thoughtful. "Very well, Daenerys, then. I will not keep you long. I know the days are frantic with preparations. I only wish to speak to you plainly, mother to mother, or perhaps mother-to-be." Her tone softened, and she gestured for Daenerys to sit. "I know you once lost a child on the Dothraki Sea. I cannot imagine how that must have scarred you. I have lost children of my own, in a sense. My youngest girls are far away, my son Bran was crippled. This war tears us all apart." A pang shot through Daenerys at the memory of her stillborn son, Rhaego. The past felt raw sometimes, despite all she'd endured since. "You are kind to acknowledge that," Daenerys said quietly, seating herself. "I never knew if I would have another, but war does not wait on such questions." Cailin's gaze flicked to the window, her voice low. "I worry for my daughters, for all the children caught in the crossfire. Sansa and Arya left King's Landing with Ned, as you know, and they remain in Winterfell. I pray they remain safe from Lannister reach. Do you believe we can truly end this war quickly, Daenerys? Or will it be months, years of blood?" Daenerys's throat tightened. "I wish I had a certain answer, but if Renly's host and our own converge on King's Landing, we might force a quick surrender, provided Tywin does not trap us. A short war is possible, yet, cannot lie, wars have a habit of spiraling. Even if we remove Joffrey, there's Stannis to consider, and some might not accept me or Renly as monarchs. My vow is to end the Lannisters' cruelty as soon as I can." That is all I can truly promise." Cailin studied her intently. "Ned believes in you, so do many of our men, surprisingly. They see your dragons and think you are the future. Whether that future is bright or dark remains to be seen. But I see how you carry yourself, how you consult my husband with respect. If it were only the Lannisters we had to remove, I would be at peace. But this talk of multiple kings, it frightens me. The realm cannot serve so many masters." Daenerys inclined her head. "I fear the same, yet to yield my claim to Renly or to Stannis would be a betrayal of all I've survived. House Targaryen once united Westeros. Yes, through conquest, but also through forging laws and traditions that lasted centuries. My father lost all sense of justice. I cannot let that define my entire bloodline. I mean to prove we can rule better. But perhaps the realm itself should have a say in whether it follows me. As Ned has said, we might call a great council or some manner of assembly once Joffrey is removed." Caitlin's mouth curved into a faint, sad smile. "That is more than most kings or queens would concede. You do not sound like your father." Daenerys bit her lip. "I am not my father, yet I must use the power of dragons, or men will not heed me. That is the paradox." They ate in companionable silence for a time, spooning stew and sipping wine. The flicker of the candles cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Outside, the last of the daylight faded, the night sky revealed. Daenerys found the gentle quiet a small reprieve from the tensions of command. Finally, Cailin spoke again, voice subdued. "I do not know if the gods truly guide our steps. My faith has been shaken these last months. But I will pray that we can see the dawn after this war. I will pray that my daughters can return, that Ned can lay down his sword, and that you might find what you seek without drowning the realm in blood." Daenerys reached across the table, laying her hand on Caitlin's. "I promise to do my utmost. I cherish the lives of the innocent. I have seen too many horrors across the narrow sea not to understand the cost of war. If I can bring a swifter end by forging alliances, even with men like Walder Frey or Renly Baratheon, then I will. And I will strive to show mercy when we reach the capital." Cailin squeezed her hand, face etched with lingering sadness but also acceptance. "That is all I can ask. Thank you." They finished their meal soon after, parting with a mutual nod of respect. Daenerys left feeling a fragile sense that she and Cailin might yet build a bond of trust. In these uncertain times, such connections could make all the difference between unity and betrayal. On the morning of the third day, the horns sounded through Riverrun's courtyards at dawn. Fog clung to the riverbanks, the sky tinged with gray. Men roused themselves from tents and barracks, yawning, shaking off the night's chill. Horses whickered in the stables, stamping hooves impatiently. Grooms hurried to feed and bridle them. Squires rushed about with final tasks, hauling saddlebags and checking weapons. The ring of steel on steel echoed as knights tested their swords, preparing for the march. Daenerys stood in the yard with Ned, Robb, Ser Barristan, and Jorah. She wore boiled leather and wool beneath her cloak, a compromise between warmth and freedom of movement. Drogon perched on a sturdy stone post at her side, eyes gleaming with excitement at all the commotion. Regal and Viserion soared above the battlements, their shadows passing over the men who set out in long columns beyond the castle gates. Robb called out orders to the northern cavalry. They would ride as the vanguard, scouting the roads leading toward Harrenhal, ensuring no ambush lay in wait. Edmure Tully's men would follow as the center, their banners bright. The rearguard comprised a mixed force of Manderly knights and Bolton men. Daenerys noticed Roose Bolton conferring with his lieutenants in hushed tones. She did not trust that man, but Ned insisted they needed his swords. So it went in war. Cailin and Edmure would remain behind with a moderate garrison at Riverrun, holding the castle in case any Lannister stragglers tried to retake the region. Cailin embraced Ned and Robb in turn, tears glimmering in her eyes. She offered Daenerys a solemn farewell, wishing her good fortune. Daenerys thanked her quietly, then mounted her horse, a fine dappled mare that Ned had arranged. She would ride with the host for much of the journey, The dragons could provide short reconnaissance flights, but Drogon still tired if she stayed aloft too long. By mid-morning, the great host spilled forth from Riverrun, crossing the drawbridge in orderly ranks. Spears and banners stretched as far as the eye could see. Daenerys rode near Ned and Ser Barristan, scanning the horizon. Her heart quickened at the scale of it. An army marching at her side to challenge the Lannisters and break the hold of King's Landing. Some men shouted half-cheerful calls of, "Long live the Dragon Queen," or "Winter for the Lannisters." Others marched in grim silence, faces set. This was no triumphant parade but a tide of war. The first days saw them traveling over rolling farmland, the roads rutted from the passage of refugees. Abandoned cottages dotted the countryside, windows broken, signs of hasty flight. Occasionally, they encountered small groups of peasants who approached warily, seeking protection or scraps of food. Daenerys ordered that they be treated kindly, given what aid was possible. Ned approved, though some lords grumbled. War was burdensome enough without feeding others, they claimed. Daenerys reminded them that winning hearts now could mean fewer knives behind them later. On the fourth day out from Riverrun, advanced scouts reported a Lannister outpost in the distance, perhaps 200 men occupying a small stone holdfast near a crossroads. The holdfast had served as a local seat of power, but the owners must have fled or been ousted by the Lannisters. Ned conferred with Robb and Great John Umber, deciding a swift assault was best. The northern cavalry surged forward at dawn, surrounding the holdfast. Daenerys flew overhead briefly on Drogon, letting him spit flame at the gate. The wooden doors exploded in sparks and smoke, the Lannister soldiers panicking. Half tried to fight, but were overwhelmed by the Greyjohn's men. The rest attempted to flee into the fields, only to be run down by Bolton cavalry. When the brief clash ended, the holdfast was secured. Daenerys landed in the courtyard to find smoldering timbers and the stench of burnt flesh. She fought down a wave of nausea. This was war, the war she had come to wage. Still, she loathed the sight of charred corpses. Reigning in Drogon's destructive potential was essential, but an image of these half-burnt men would haunt her memory. Word of their progress and the presence of dragons spread quickly. As they moved closer to Harrenhal, peasants and captured Lannister stragglers alike told tales of the monstrous shape in the sky, how the Northmen marched behind a silver-haired queen with living flame at her command. Some stories grew fantastical, painting Daenerys as a sorceress who devoured enemies. She did her best to refute such rumors, but fear worked in their favor for now. Armies parted before them. Local lords once cowed by the Lannisters began to send discreet messages of loyalty to the Targaryen Stark host. On the seventh day, the weather turned sour. Heavy clouds loomed, and a cold rain swept in from the west, making the roads slick. The men huddled in their cloaks, cursing the mud. The wagons dragged painfully. Daenerys occasionally took flight on Drogon to check the road ahead, though the dragon disliked the rain, hissing in displeasure as droplets beaded on his black scales. Ned pressed them forward regardless. Time was too precious to lose. They reached a vantage on the eighth day that overlooked the expanse of the God's Eye Lake, a gray mirror under the cloudy sky. Beyond its far shore rose the broken towers of Harrenhal, looming black and forbidding. Even from miles away, Daenerys could see the massive curtain walls, the melted stone turrets from where Aegon the Conqueror's dragons had once unleashed their fury. An eerie hush settled over the ranks. This was the realm's largest castle, though half in ruin, said to be haunted by curses upon every lord who dared to hold it. Now Tywin Lannister held it, if the reports were still correct. A scout returned at dusk, breathless and soaked, reporting that Tywin had indeed installed a garrison in Harrenhal, but part of his force was arrayed outside in a defensive camp near the southern edge. The total might number 15 or 20,000, though some portion was out raiding or patrolling. Tywin himself was rumored to be within the castle's halls, planning his next move. Another scout claimed to have glimpsed the mountain, Gregor Clegane, leading a smaller party near the outskirts of the God's Eye. The cunning might be that Tywin was waiting for them to attempt a siege, while the rest of his men circled behind, or that he was preparing to march on King's Landing if Renly approached from the south. That night, Daenerys and Ned convened a war council in a large, sodden pavilion pitched on a slope above the lake. Flickering lanterns illuminated the faces of lords and knights. Roose Bolton, Great John Umber, Lady Meage Mormont, a scattering of Tully bannermen. The sound of rain drummed on the canvas overhead. The men spoke in hushed, tense voices, describing Harrenhal's formidable outer walls, which towered close to 80 feet in places, though many sections had collapsed over the centuries. "How do we proceed?" Great John asked, banging a fist lightly on the table. "Storming Harrenhal is madness. It's said the place can hold 10,000 inside those walls, if they're properly manned." Ned's eyes darted to the battered map. "We could attempt a blockade, deny them supplies, let Tywin wither. But that might take weeks or months, and we must join Renly soon. We can't leave Tywin uncontained behind us." Bolton spoke softly. "We might bait him out. If we appear to settle for a siege, he might ride forth to strike at us. Or if we slip around to the eastern side, toward the King's Road, he might fear we're marching on King's Landing and attempt to intercept." Ser Barristan, arms folded, offered another angle. "If Tywin is truly concerned about King's Landing, he might ride out soon anyway. Joffrey is his grandson, after all. He won't want to see the capital fall to Renly and you, your grace. Perhaps the simplest plan is to wait a short while, see if Tywin abandons Harrenhal. If he does not, we can safely circumvent him and push on." Robb frowned. "But if he stays in Harrenhal, then once we move past, he'll be free to strike our rear. He could harass our supply lines or coordinate with loyalists in the Crownlands to trap us between two forces. I dislike leaving an enemy fortress behind us, especially with a man as cunning as Tywin inside." Daenerys rubbed her temples. "We can't remain idle. A direct assault is too costly. A long siege leaves us stranded, and bypassing Harrenhal invites a flank attack. We need cunning." She paused, considering. "Could we deploy the dragons to force him out? Harrenhal's walls may be tall, but Aegon's dragons once melted them. We do not have dragons of that size yet, but we can strike terror, perhaps set fire to the outer defenses, enough that Tywin might sally forth." A troubled silence fell. Even smaller dragons possess terrifying destructive power, but attacking Harrenhal directly might risk them being shot by scorpions or crossbow bolts. The castle was massive, with plenty of vantage points from which defenders could retaliate. Drogon, Rha, Eagle, and Viserion had grown, yet they were nowhere near Balerions' old size. Ned's jaw tightened. "Risky. If we lose a dragon in some cunning Lannister trap, the advantage we hold might vanish overnight. We might do well to threaten the walls, but not mount a full-scale assault." The Great John exhaled loudly, shaking his head. "There must be some trick. Did the Targaryens not once breach those walls with dragonfire alone?" Ser Barristan nodded. "Yes, Aegon the Conqueror's dragons burned Harrenhal. Some of the towers are still warped from that day, but those were grown beasts. Ours are still youths. A direct assault might be beyond their power." Bolton's pale eyes flicked around the table. "It might be more prudent to approach from the south side, feign an attempt to cross the lake or bypass the fortress. If Tywin believes we're leaving him behind, he may have no choice but to ride out. Or he might attempt a night attack on our encampment. In either event, we can meet him in open ground with dragons in the sky." Robb pressed his lips together. "It's a gamble, but it may be our best chance." They debated late into the night, the rain never relenting. Eventually, the council agreed on a plan. They would move their host to the southern edges of the God's Eye, setting camp in a position that suggested they aimed to bypass Harrenhal entirely. They would remain vigilant for any sally by Tywin. If he stayed put, they would skirmish near the walls, using dragonfire sparingly, trying to spark fear that the entire fortress might burn as in the days of old. The hope was that Tywin, unwilling to be pinned or bypassed, would come forth. If he brought his entire army, Daenerys' dragons and the northern cavalry would greet him on open ground. If he split his force, they might overwhelm whichever portion emerged. A precarious dance, but better than letting the war drag on for months. The next morning, The host skirted the western shoreline of the God's Eye, the castle of Harrenhal visible in the distance. Great towers jutted from the mist, their tops melted into grotesque shapes by ancient dragon flame. The men grew uneasy at the sight. Stories abounded of curses upon the place. Even the wind seemed to whisper among the reeds along the lake's edge. Daenerys flew overhead on Drogon for a short span, scanning for Lannister outriders. She spotted a few scattered pickets near the southwestern approach, but none ventured close to the main force. Smoke rose from within Harrenhal's walls, signifying active fires or forges. She suspected Tywin was indeed there, watching them from behind the massive battlements. They made camp on relatively dry ground near the south shore, half a league from the foot of Harrenhal's outer walls. Pavilions went up under a sullen sky. Men built palisades, watchtowers, and ditch lines. Scouts rode in all directions, mindful that Lannister cavalry might come from any side. Days passed with a tense stalemate. Tywin did not emerge in force. A few Lannister outriders tested their perimeter at night, but vanished like ghosts when confronted. Archers tried potshots from Harrenhal's walls at dawn, but the distance was too great. On the third day of the standoff, Daenerys, Ned, and Robb led a small, carefully guarded party in a feint toward the castle's main gate. Daenerys rode Drogon overhead, letting him roar and spit flame at the air, not quite reaching the walls but close enough to send sparks dancing across the battlements. Lannister archers answered with volleys of arrows, but none struck the dragon. Several arrows hissed past below, lodging in the muddy ground. The defenders banged shields, shouting curses. Tywin himself did not appear. Daenerys circled once, dread coiling in her gut at the idea of flying closer. Harrenhal's ramparts bristled with scorpions, large siege crossbows capable of wounding a dragon. She withdrew before taking further risk. On the ground, Ned signaled a retreat. The small demonstration had done little beyond sowing a bit of fear. That night, the tension in camp was palpable. Men cursed Tywin's stubbornness and the cursed castle's defenses. The plan to lure him out seemed stalled. Daenerys paced her pavilion, swirling a cup of wine but barely drinking. Robb had gone to inspect the perimeter. Ned stepped in, his face drawn with worry. "He's not moving," Ned said quietly. "A few scouts think they spotted some Lannister cavalry departing eastward, maybe heading toward the Blackwater. But the bulk remain." Daenerys set her cup down. If he has the provisions, he could wait for months. Meanwhile, Eagle and Viserion had grown, yet they were nowhere near Balerian's old size. Ned's jaw tightened. "Risky. If we lose a dragon in some cunning Lannister trap, the advantage we hold might vanish overnight. We might do well to threaten the walls, but not mount a full-scale assault." The Great John exhaled loudly, shaking his head. There must be some trick. Did the Targaryens not once breach those walls with dragonfire alone? Ser Barristan nodded. Yes, Aegon the Conqueror's dragons burned Harrenhal. Some of the towers are still warped from that day, but those were grown beasts. Ours are still youths. A direct assault might be beyond their power. Bolton's pale eyes flicked around the table. It might be more prudent to approach from the south side, feign an attempt to cross the lake or bypass the fortress. If Tywin believes we're leaving him behind, he may have no choice but to ride out. Or he might attempt a night attack on our encampment. In either event, we can meet him in open ground with dragons in the sky. Robb pressed his lips together. It's a gamble, but it may be our best chance. They debated late into the night, the rain never relenting. Eventually, the council agreed on a plan. They would move their host to the southern edges of the God's Eye, setting camp in a position that suggested they aimed to bypass Harrenhal entirely. They would remain vigilant for any sally by Tywin. If he stayed put, they would skirmish near the walls, using dragonfire sparingly, trying to spark fear that the entire fortress might burn as in the days of old. The hope was that Tywin, unwilling to be pinned or bypassed, would come forth. If he brought his entire army, Daenerys's dragons and the northern cavalry would greet him on open ground. If he split his force, they might overwhelm whichever portion emerged. A precarious dance, but better than letting the war drag on for months. The next morning, the host skirted the western shoreline of the God's Eye, the castle of Harrenhal visible in the distance. Great towers jutted from the mist, their tops melted into grotesque shapes by ancient dragon flame. The men grew uneasy at the sight. Stories abounded of curses upon the place. Even the wind seemed to whisper among the reeds along the lake's edge. Daenerys flew overhead on Drogon for a short span, scanning for Lannister outriders. She spotted a few scattered pickets near the southwestern approach, but none ventured close to the main force. Smoke rose from within Harrenhal's walls, signifying active fires or forges. She suspected Tywin was indeed there, watching them from behind the massive battlements. They made camp on relatively dry ground near the south shore, half a league from the foot of Harrenhal's outer walls. Pavilions went up under a sullen sky. Men built palisades, watchtowers, and ditch lines. Scouts rode in all directions, mindful that Lannister cavalry might come from any side. Days passed with a tense stalemate. Tywin did not emerge in force. A few Lannister outriders tested their perimeter at night, but vanished like ghosts when confronted. Archers tried potshots from Harrenhal's walls at dawn, but the distance was too great. On the third day of the standoff, Daenerys, Ned, and Robb led a small, carefully guarded party in a feint toward the castle's main gate. Daenerys rode Drogon overhead, letting him roar and spit flame at the air, not quite reaching the walls but close enough to send sparks dancing across the battlements. Lannister archers answered with volleys of arrows, but none struck the dragon. Several arrows hissed past below, lodging in the muddy ground. The defenders banged shields, shouting curses. Tywin himself did not appear. Daenerys circled once, dread coiling in her gut at the idea of flying closer. Harrenhal's ramparts bristled with scorpions, large siege crossbows capable of wounding a dragon. She withdrew before taking further risk. On the ground, Ned signaled a retreat. The small demonstration had done little beyond sowing a bit of fear. That night, the tension in camp was palpable. Men cursed Tywin's stubbornness and the cursed castle's defenses. The plan to lure him out seemed stalled. Daenerys paced her pavilion, swirling a cup of wine but barely drinking. Robb had gone to inspect the perimeter. Ned stepped in, his face drawn with worry. "He's not moving," Ned said quietly. "A few scouts think they spotted some Lannister cavalry departing eastward, maybe heading toward the Blackwater. But the bulk remain." Daenerys set her cup down. "If he has the provisions, he could wait for months. Meanwhile, Renly will approach King's Landing from the south. If we don't join him in time, he might attempt the siege alone or be repelled. The city's walls are formidable. We risk losing the chance for a quick victory if we remain here." Ned nodded grimly. "We might need a more direct approach. What if we send a strong detachment toward the Blackwater under Robb or another commander to link up with Renly? The rest remain here to keep Tywin pinned. If Tywin tries to follow the detachment, we can strike him in the open. If he stays behind, the detachment can assist Renly in taking the city." Daenerys weighed the idea. Splitting their forces was dangerous, but so was waiting. If we do that, we must ensure the dragons are on the move with the detachment. Otherwise, Tywin might sense he can crush the portion we leave behind. Yet if we leave him a token force at Harrenhal, he might sally out and devour it. This is the puzzle. A brief silence passed, each considering the risk. Finally, Ned spoke. "Let's see what counsel Robb and the others have. If we split the host carefully, send half with you and the dragons to aid Renly, while I remain with the other half near Harrenhal. We can fortify ourselves enough that Tywin dares not leave the safety of the walls to attack. Or if he does, we can retreat, luring him away. Your half can swiftly move on King's Landing, ensuring Renly doesn't face Joffrey alone." Daenerys folded her arms, tension gnawing her insides. She disliked the idea of dividing their strength, but the logic was compelling. Time was slipping away. "I trust your ability to hold your position here. If Tywin emerges in force, can you truly hold him back?" Ned exhaled. "If I entrench and keep scouts vigilant, I can withdraw if needed, staying out of his reach. I won't let him corner us." Meanwhile, you can press on with the larger cavalry force and the dragons. Once you and Renly converge, you'll outnumber whatever stands at King's Landing. The city might fall swiftly. All right, Daenerys agreed quietly. We'll propose it to Robb in the morning. That next morning, Ned laid out the plan to a gathering of lords in the main command pavilion. The Great John, Lady Mormont, Bolton, and several Tully knights joined. The rain had eased, though clouds still lingered. The men listened intently. Robb had reservations. He disliked leaving Harrenhal unsubdued. But in the end, the consensus formed. The war's deciding blow would likely come at King's Landing, with or without Harrenhal's fall. If they waited for Tywin to come out, they might lose momentum. And if Tywin was truly cunning, he might never come out. So it was agreed. Half the host would remain camped near Harrenhal under Ned's command, a mixture of northern infantry, archers, and some cavalry for mobility. They would harass Tywin's foraging parties, keep the fortress under partial blockade, and watch for any major movement. Daenerys would take the other half, mostly cavalry, plus the Dothraki outriders, though their numbers were limited here in Westeros and Manderly Knights. Robb would command the Northmen under Daenerys, with Great John and Bolton each contributing their banners. The dragons would accompany Daenerys to ensure she could assist Renly in a swift strike at King's Landing. If Tywin stayed put, they'd lose the capital. If he rode out to chase Daenerys, Ned's force could strike from behind or slip away to rejoin her later. 2 days were spent reorganizing, splitting supplies, reconfirming each force's chain of command. Tents, wagons, and lines shifted in a flurry of confusion and occasional grumbling. But by the second evening, it was done. Daenerys felt a knot in her stomach at leaving Ned behind. He had been her stalwart ally from the moment she fled King's Landing. Part of her feared Tywin would pounce, that Harrenhal's curses might devour them. Yet the plan was the plan. On the final night, she walked the perimeter with Ned. The sky clear at last, a myriad of stars overhead. They spoke of simpler things, his memories of Winterfell, how Arya used to chase cats, how Sansa once dreamed of princes at tournaments. Daenerys admitted she had never truly known a childhood free of fear. It was a quiet bond they shared, each shaped by duty and sorrow. By the time they parted, she felt a surge of resolve to make the best use of this gamble and meet Ned again in triumph. At dawn, Daenerys led her portion of the army away from the looming walls of Harrenhal. A few horns sounded behind them in farewell. She looked back once, glimpsing Ned standing on a small rise, his cloak stirring in the wind, flanked by the banners of Stark and Tully. He lifted a hand in silent benediction. Daenerys raised hers in return, then spurred her horse onward. Drogon swooped overhead, letting out a raw cry. The men marched in disciplined columns, heading east, aiming to pick up the Gold Road and then swing south to meet Renly or else turn directly toward King's Landing depending on the latest word. The Great John took the lead cavalry vanguard, roaring cheerful threats at any Lannister who dared cross their path. Bolton rode somewhere in the columns behind, silent as ever, his face betraying no hint of motive. The first week of marching took them through the Riverlands' eastern reaches, dotted with small towns that had seen occasional Lannister raiders. Most cheered when they learned the Targaryen-Stark alliance was driving out the lions. Daenerys tried to keep discipline tight, forbidding plunder. She wanted the small folk to see her as a liberator, not another conqueror. Some lords, especially Bolton's men, grumbled, but Robb and the Great John were quick to enforce her orders. By the time they veered onto the Gold Road, heading toward the Crownlands, they had grown into a disciplined, if weary, host. Occasional messengers from Riverrun reached them, bearing updates on Ned's stalemate with Tywin. The Lannisters had made a few probing attacks, but no major confrontation. At the same time, ravens from the south arrived with tidings that Renly had advanced past Bitterbridge and was converging on the Blackwater region with the Tyrells. The city braced for siege. Joffrey, furious, commanded all loyal lords to muster in the Crownlands to defend him. The tension built with each day. Daenerys could almost smell the final clash coming. They pressed on relentlessly, traveling from dawn until dusk, with only short rests. The late autumn sun burned gold across fields now half-harvested, though the threat of an early winter lingered in the chill that crept over the nights. Villagers sometimes fled upon seeing their approach, only to peer from doorways once they realized these were not Lannisters. Daenerys received them kindly, promising an end to Joffrey's cruelty. Word spread that the Dragon Queen was coming, and though many did not fully trust her, they at least saw that her men did not pillage or slaughter as the lions had done. On the 10th day of this march, Daenerys's outriders spotted the edges of Kingswood. This thick forest lay southwest of the capital, a known haunt of bandits and outlaws. Past it, the Rose Road from Highgarden would join the Gold Road from Lannisport, heading straight to King's Landing. That evening, as the army made camp in a clearing near the wood's edge, outriders came galloping in with news. A large force approached from the south, bearing Renly's banners. Robb, Daenerys, and the Great Jon assembled a swift party to investigate. They found Renly's vanguard around midday next, crossing a broad meadow. Bright banners snapped in the breeze. The golden stag of Baratheon, entwined with the rose of Tyrell, plus myriad lesser sigils of the Reach and the Stormlands. Ranks of knights in polished plate, foot soldiers and crossbowmen stretched for leagues. Daenerys took to the sky briefly with Drogon, scanning the spectacle. It might well be the largest force she had yet seen in Westeros. It exceeded her host in sheer scale, though many were less battle-tested. She descended near a stand of poplars where Renly's outriders had set up a meeting point. Renly himself rode out, accompanied by Margaery Tyrell, Ser Loras, and a small retinue of shining knights. He wore a green cloak pinned with a golden stag, a crown of gilded antlers upon his neatly trimmed hair, and a broad smile that might have been sincerity or performance. Margaery's gown was modest for a wartime march, but still embroidered with subtle roses. Ser Loras glinted in full plate, a rainbow cloak draped from his shoulders in memory of his time among the Rainbow Guard. They reined up at the edge of Daenerys's lines, where Robb, the Great Jon, and others waited. Daenerys dismounted Drogon, letting the black dragon curl around her in the grass, eyes fixed on the Baratheon party. "Your Grace," Renly said, inclining his head at Daenerys in an exaggerated flourish. "I see you have brought half the realm with you, and your dragons. Excellent." His gaze flicked over the men behind her. "We have marched swiftly up from Bitterbridge as agreed. Our numbers swell daily. The Tyrell bannermen are most eager to see King's Landing freed from Joffrey's tyranny." Daenerys measured his tone. "Well met, King Renly. Our host stands ready. Ned Stark and half our force remain containing Tywin near Harrenhal, but we can still field a mighty army. If we converge on King's Landing now, while Tywin is pinned, Joffrey will have no choice but surrender or see the city taken by storm." Renly exchanged glances with Margaery. She nodded, stepping forward with a soft smile. "We have begun blockading the roads leading into the city from the south. My father, Lord Mace Tyrell, has cut off grain shipments. Already the people suffer. It will not be long before King's Landing starves, unless they open the gates or send an army out to break our siege." Robb looked uneasy. "Starvation is a slow and cruel method. I'd prefer we end this quickly." Margaery's gaze flicked to him. "Better that we starve them into submission than slaughter thousands with steel. But if you have a better plan, Lord Stark, we will hear it." Daenerys folded her arms. "We might not have time for a long siege. If Tywin breaks free of Harrenhal or if Joffrey summons other houses, the city could become a trap. A coordinated strike using our combined armies and dragons could breach the gates swiftly. The city watch might not remain loyal if they see the odds. My concern is the small folk inside. I do not wish to burn the city. If Joffrey hunkers down behind the walls, we may need a quick show of force. Perhaps that means a partial blockade, combined with offers of mercy for any who open the gates." Renly's eyes gleamed. The city would quake at the sight. As the meeting concluded, Daenerys pulled Robb aside. "If Joffrey refuses, we face a siege. I must consider how to breach the walls swiftly without reducing the city to ash. Perhaps a demonstration, setting fire to a small portion of the outer defenses. But I worry about the innocents inside." Robb's gaze was grim. In war, innocence is a fragile shield, but we will do what we can. The city watch might open the gates if their morale breaks. I pray it happens before we must fling ourselves at the walls. At dawn, the ultimatum was delivered. A herald in green and gold livery, accompanied by several outriders from both Renly's and Daenerys' forces, rode to the main gates. Trumpets blared. The herald shouted that Joffrey was a bastard, that the rightful kings, pointedly plural though it made Daenerys bristle, demanded his surrender. The watchers on the battlements answered with jeers and a few arrows that fell short. No official reply came. The gates remained barred, the walls manned. Word spread that the Red Keep's banner, Baratheon gold on black, still flew, defiant. Renly proposed a second approach. They'd let Marjorie's ladies carry a letter of clemency to the walls, offering a chance for the city watch to switch sides. Daenerys supported the idea, though she doubted the watchmen on the walls had authority to respond. Sure enough, the letter was taken by a sergeant who promised to pass it up the chain, but no answer came. By midday, a cold wind blew from the south. Daenerys, perched on Drogon, flew a wide circle around the city, letting the populace glimpse the dragon's silhouette. She spotted gatherings on the ramparts, hushes of fear or wonder. She soared close enough that archers tried a few shots, none coming near. Her heart hammered each time an arrow hissed past, but Drogon twisted gracefully away. Rhaegal and Viserion soared at a higher altitude, left alone for the moment. Below, the camps bristled with soldiers, siege engines, and fresh spiked barriers. The city was ringed on every road, the farmland ablaze with watchfires each night. Still, the gates did not open. That evening, word came that the city's stocks of wheat and barley were meager. They might feed themselves for a month if they rationed severely, perhaps 2, but eventually they would run out. Marjorie suggested they wait, starve the defenders into submission. Robb worried that each day gave Joffrey more time to fortify, or for Tywin to slip free of Harrenhal. Daenerys found herself torn once again between a moral desire to minimize suffering and a strategic need for speed. On the second day of the siege, King's Landing awoke to find dragon-shaped shadows flitting across the walls. Rhaegal and Viserion soared in a menacing display. Daenerys stood near the front lines with Renly, Marjorie, and Robb, observing from a safe distance. She saw the gold cloaks standing in silent ranks on the battlements, uncertain. She yearned for them to throw open the gates, but the gates remained shut. At midday, a single figure emerged onto the walls near the King's Gate, clad in golden armor. The watchers recognized him as the Hound, Sandor Clegane, Joffrey's sworn shield. He shouted curses at the besiegers, declared that they'd never breach the walls. Then he vanished again. No parley followed. Renly ground his teeth. This is madness. The boy must know he's outnumbered. Or is Cersei controlling everything from the keep? Daenerys stared at the tall ramparts. They cling to power. They might be hoping Tywin arrives to rescue them, or that Stannis emerges to fight us both. We cannot stand idle forever. A hush fell as they recognized the moment approaching. A forced assault or a demonstration of destructive might. Renly's lords began arraying siege towers and rams. Marjorie and Robb both cautioned that the walls were high, the defenses strong, so casualties would be great. Daenerys realized they were drifting toward an all-out storming of the city. She weighed the possibility of using the dragons to burn large gates or sections of walls. Yet the Red Keep perched on a hill above the city. If they forced entry at the gates, they'd have to fight street by street. The potential for widespread devastation was enormous. That evening, as the armies prepared, Daenerys called a meeting with Renly, Robb, Marjorie, and a handful of close advisors. Tension crackled in the lamplit pavilion. Renly insisted they could storm the city within 2 or 3 days, capturing at least the outlying districts. Marjorie supported using patience and hunger to break the city from within. Robb hovered between, worried about time. Daenerys proposed a partial measure. They would assault one gate with siege towers while the dragons provided overhead support. If the City Watch saw the unstoppable might of the combined assault, they might capitulate quickly. If not, they'd break through to at least hold a portion of the city. She wanted to avoid a full-scale conflagration if possible. The lords finally agreed, though each with reservations. Margaery prayed that the small folk might rebel against Joffrey the moment an assault began, rising to open gates from within. Robb prepared the northern cavalry to charge once a breach was made. Renly's knights formed up to protect the siege engines. Daenerys readied Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion for a controlled strike at the gates. They would attack at dawn. That night, Daenerys hardly slept. She walked alone near the lines of tents, hearing men talk in subdued tones, some sharpening blades, others praying. The knowledge that tomorrow might see blood in the streets of the city, her family's old seat, weighed heavily. She asked herself if there was another way: infiltration, bribery of the gold cloaks, or a rousing speech. But the city was locked down. No easy infiltration seemed possible. She could not bribe watchers she could not reach. Her final hope was that a sharp assault would crack Cersei's will or spark a mutiny inside. Dawn broke behind gray clouds. Drums rolled through the combined camps. Siege towers rumbled forward, pulled by teams of oxen. Soldiers marched in dense columns behind mantlets for cover. Archers lined up, ready to loose a rain of arrows at the walls. Daenerys mounted Drogon, the black dragon baring his teeth in excitement. She could feel his tension, the hunger for flame. Rhaegal and Viserion soared overhead, guided by a few Dothraki handlers with whistles. Robb and the northern cavalry waited on the flank, lances shining. Renly's knights formed the core, bearing green and gold banners. A hush fell as they neared the city's main gate, the King's Gate. On the walls, gold cloaks braced themselves behind crenellations. Crossbows, scorpions, and archers aimed outward. A faint wind carried the smell of the sea from Blackwater Bay. For a moment, all was still. Then a trumpet blared. The siege towers rumbled closer, archers behind them letting loose a withering volley. Return fire came in a snapping hail of arrows and quarrels. Men shouted, some falling. Daenerys spurred Drogon into the sky, Rhaegal and Viserion in loose formation behind. They swooped near the gatehouse, out of range of the scorpions if they remained in constant motion. Drogon roared, exhaling a jet of flame that engulfed the top of the gate's outer ramparts. Gold cloaks screamed, fleeing from the swirl of fire. Some hurled spears upward, none striking home. Below, the battered gate began to smoke and blacken under the intense heat. On the ground, the siege towers crashed forward. Renly's men hammered the city walls with grapnels, trying to scale. The defenders poured boiling oil, fired crossbows, hurled rocks. Screams and clangs mingled with the roar of flame. Daenerys soared overhead again, urging Drogon to blast the gate. The thick wooden beams caught, sending up black smoke. Rhaegal joined in, spitting a narrower stream of greenish flame that flickered along the parapets. The gatehouse structure creaked ominously. Suddenly, a scorpion bolt whistled past, missing Drogon by a yard. A second flew wide. The defenders had repositioned scorpions to the gatehouse interior. Fear jolted Daenerys. She guided Drogon into a swift turn, feeling the rush of air. Too many passes over the same spot would let them zero in. Rhaegal likewise peeled off, uncertain. Viserion circled high out of range. On the ground, the battered gate threatened to collapse. A portion of the wall near the gatehouse began to crumble under the combined effect of dragonfire and siege engineering. Men in the towers cheered as they saw the stone exterior crack. Renly's trumpets sounded a renewed push. Soldiers with rams charged forward, slamming the compromised gate. Daenerys glimpsed Robb leading cavalry on the flank, keeping watch for a sally by the defenders. Arrows and quarrels rained down, but the raw fear of dragons in the sky unsettled the gold cloaks. More than once, she saw men scrambling away from positions where the dragonfire licked close. Then a thunderous crash came. Part of the gatehouse roof collapsed inward, flames licking at the shattered beams. Men screamed, half buried in rubble. A section of the massive wooden gate broke under the ram, leaving a gap. Renly's men poured into the courtyard beyond, clashing with the defenders in a wild melee. Smoke and dust choked the air. Daenerys circled overhead, heart hammering. She had to see if the watchers along the walls would break. Her eyes stung with the acrid smoke. She signaled Rhaegal and Viserion to keep close but not to drench the area in flame. Friend and foe were intermingled now. The last thing she wanted was to burn her own men. With the gate battered open, the flood of allied soldiers poured in, and the gold cloaks fell back in disarray, many dropping weapons. Some tried to rally in the narrow streets, but cavalry crashed in from behind once the opening widened. Daenerys landed Drogon carefully on the rubble near the broken gate, letting him roar a challenge at the remaining defenders. The effect was immediate. A wave of men flung down their arms, shouting for mercy. A number, perhaps loyal to the Lannisters, still fought, but the majority seemed terrified, uncertain whether to keep dying for Joffrey. Smoke thickened around them, swirling with dust. Daenerys coughed, covering her mouth. She saw Ser Barristan on foot, leading a wedge of northern troops through the gate, pressing the defenders deeper into the city. Renly's banner advanced. Marjorie Tyrell was not in the front lines, but her standard-bearers joined the charge. For a brief moment, it looked as though they might seize the Gate District with minimal further bloodshed. Then came a terrifying bellow, this one from the interior. A group of Lannister men-at-arms, led by the Hound, burst out from a side street, crashing into the newly entered allies. The Hound's massive figure in heavy plate scattered lesser knights. He roared curses, his hound helm dripping with what looked like old gore. Daenerys tensed. She knew Sandor Clegane had a fierce reputation, though rumored also to be at odds with Joffrey at times. Robb spurred his horse forward, Great Jon at his side, aiming to intercept the Hound's charge. Spears clashed, horses screamed. Daenerys advanced carefully, Drogon bounding across shattered rubble. If the fight parted enough, she might have Drogon breathe fire, but it was too risky with her own men locked in melee. Suddenly, from the ramparts overhead, a scorpion bolt lashed down. This time it found a target, Rhaegal, who had circled too low. The bolt caught him in the shoulder of his wing, tearing a gash. Rhaegal screeched in agony, veering wildly, spewing green-tinged flame that scorched a portion of the wall. Daenerys cried out, heart lurching. She turned to see Rhaegal beating his wings frantically, black blood dripping from the wound. The dragon flailed, smashing into a turret before regaining altitude in a shaky climb. Daenerys felt panic swirl. If Rhaegal lost flight, he could crash among the rooftops, possibly be swarmed by defenders. She prayed he could limp away. Viserion responded with a vengeful swoop, unleashing flame at the scorpion position, sending men leaping from the walls in terror. On the ground, the fight raged. The Hound cut down 2 Tyrell knights, but Great Jon roared and swung a massive warhammer, forcing the Hound to give ground. Robb's cavalry hammered the last cluster of gold cloaks. More men from inside the city approached, uncertain if they wanted to fight. Shouts of "Lay down your arms!" echoed. Some dropped swords, others advanced in confusion, uncertain who commanded them. Daenerys forced herself to focus. The gate was effectively in their hands, but the city was large, with labyrinthine streets and thousands of potential defenders. She had to rally a push to the Red Keep, or else secure a surrender. Smoke billowed from the partial conflagration, sending columns of black haze into the dawn sky. Renly arrived with a mounted retinue, seeing that the gatehouse courtyard was nearly won. He pointed his sword toward the city's interior. Forward, to the Red Keep. Show them no quarter if they resist. The allied soldiers roared, surging deeper into King's Landing. Daenerys dismounted, scanning for any sign of a central command among the defenders. Joffrey or Cersei might be cowering in the keep. If they seized the keep quickly, the city might fall without a street-by-street battle. She left Drogon to guard the gate approach, trusting his presence would deter any attempt to retake it. She commanded a group of Manderly knights to remain with him, to keep the path open. Then she joined a column of northern infantry pushing east along a broad avenue. Sooty air filled her lungs. Bodies littered the street, both gold cloaks and allied knights. Civilians peeked from doorways, eyes wide with terror. Some shouted for the Dragon Queen or for King Renly, uncertain who was who. One older man brandished a pot at the gold cloaks, screaming, "Down with the Lannisters!" Others shrank away, cursing all sides. As the column rounded a corner, they ran into a barricade of crates and debris manned by about 50 gold cloaks. Their officer, a stocky man with a drooping mustache, shouted at them to hold. Arrows hissed overhead. Daenerys ducked behind a collapsed cart. Robb advanced with a shield, returning fire with archers behind him. Before the defenders could mount a serious stand, Viserion descended overhead, letting out a roar that rattled windows. The barricade men scattered in sheer panic. Some threw down weapons, others fled down side alleys. Daenerys pressed on. The city was turning chaotic. In some districts, gold cloaks deserted en masse or huddled uncertainly, no doubt terrified of the dragons. In others, fierce Lannister loyalists fought like cornered wolves, spurred on by fear of retribution or devotion to the lion. The small folk, many hungry and resentful, unleashed their anger on cornered gold cloaks or retreated into cellars. Fires spread from the gatehouse area, though the allied forces tried to keep it contained. Occasional glimpses of flickering flame along rooftops told Daenerys that the dragons overhead were still active, though hopefully not unleashing wanton destruction. Before long, they neared the heart of the city, climbing the hills toward the Red Keep. The streets narrowed, jammed with refuse. Another wave of gold cloaks blocked the way, led by a knight in red armor bearing the Golden Lion of Lannister. He roared a challenge, demanding they step no further or face death as traitors to the true king. Daenerys recognized the knight as one of the Kingsguard, Ser Meryn Trant, perhaps. Robb signaled a charge. Steel clashed again. Daenerys ducked behind a barrel as crossbow bolts snapped. A Mormont spearman impaled one Lannister soldier. Another slashed at Robb's horse. Robb pivoted skillfully, driving his sword into the attacker's shoulder. Trant tried to stand his ground, but the tide of Northmen overwhelmed his position. He fell with a scream under a half-dozen stabbing spears. The rest of the Lannisters fled. Up ahead, the Red Keep's walls rose, a final fortress within the city. Daenerys glimpsed a massive gate and ramp leading up to the keep's main entrance. Archers lined the battlements, and a portcullis blocked the way. The keep itself perched high, overlooking the city and the Blackwater. If they meant to finish this, they had to seize that fortress or force those inside to surrender. Summoning her breath, Daenerys called for a messenger. "Find Regal or Viserion, bring them here. We need one more flame assault on that gate if it stays closed," she ordered, though she worried about Regal's injury. Maybe Viserion alone could handle it. The messenger ran off. As the allied forces consolidated, more men arrived from side streets. She spotted Renly's stag banner among them, along with Marjorie's retinue. Another wave of gold cloaks tried to hold the ramp, but their lines broke at the sight of massed knights ascending. The portcullis above rained arrows. The allied archers responded. Another swirl of chaos as men fell on both sides. Then a thunderous roar echoed overhead. Drogon arrived, having left the gates in the care of Manderly knights. The black dragon beat his wings, coming in low. Daenerys shouted for the men to pull back from the gates. Soldiers scrambled to the edges of the ramp. Drogon opened his jaws, unleashing a torrent of flame that engulfed the portcullis. The metal bars glowed red-hot, the wooden support behind them bursting into flames. Archers on the walls shrieked, fleeing the blaze. When Drogon's fire subsided, the portcullis was half-melted, twisted and sagging. Allied men rushed forward with axes and crowbars, hacking at the softened metal. The defenders remaining inside the courtyard shot a volley of arrows, some finding marks among the men prying at the bars. Daenerys clenched her fists. They were so close. Another burst of flame from Drogon forced the defenders to retreat deeper into the keep yard. Greatjon Umber himself led the final hacking at the warped gate. With a groan of tearing iron, the remains of the portcullis gave way, clanging down. A wide opening yawned into the Red Keep's courtyard. A chaotic fight erupted as the allies charged in. The courtyard was large, ringed by walls and lined with smaller buildings, stables, barracks, halls. Lannister men, gold cloaks, and even a few members of the Kingsguard attempted a last stand near the entrance to Maegor's Holdfast, the inner fortress. Daenerys dismounted Drogon just outside the shattered gate, letting him stand guard. She could see Renly's banner to the left, Robb's direwolf to the right, each side pressing the defenders. The clang of steel was relentless. She advanced behind a group of Mormont spears, scanning for any sign of Joffrey, Cersei, or other high-value targets. It was said the Red Keep's labyrinthine corridors could hide them for days. Then a hush rippled through the defenders as the Hound reappeared, stalking across the courtyard. His helmet was gone, revealing a burned face twisted in fury. He snarled at the gold cloaks to hold their ground, but many wavered. Blood streaked his sword. Daenerys hesitated. The man was formidable. But from the right flank came Robb, sword raised, flanked by Great Jon Umber. The Hound turned, spit on the ground, and launched himself at them. Blades rang off steel. Robb ducked a savage slash, returning a thrust that skittered off the Hound's armor. The Great Jon roared and heaved his warhammer. The Hound evaded by a hair. Another clash of steel. Daenerys felt fear for Robb. She had seen the Hound carve through men with savage ease. But Robb was quick, well-trained by Ned. He parried a blow fork, ed the Hound back with a cunning slash. Great Jon hammered down on the Hound's guard. Sensing he was outnumbered, Sandor Clegane cursed, shoved one of his own gold cloaks aside, and retreated deeper into the keep, disappearing through an archway. The gold cloaks, deprived of their champion, dropped weapons or fled. Amid the swirl, Daenerys saw Margaery entering with a retinue, urging men not to slaughter the gold cloaks who yielded. "They are our subjects now," she cried. The gold cloaks nearest her bowed or muttered surrender, anxious to avoid dragonfire or the Tyrell swords. Within minutes, the courtyard was in allied hands, though pockets of Lannister loyalists might remain. Shouts echoed that the King's Tower was sealed, that men inside refused to surrender. Ser Loras Tyrell led a group to secure the royal apartments. The city seemed to be falling around them. Daenerys pressed forward, stepping around bodies. She smelled blood, smoke, and fear. If Joffrey still lived, he would be in the Red Keep's deeper chambers or possibly cowering with Cersei in the Queen's apartments. The entire fortress was a maze, though. She saw Robb pick his way through the carnage, blood on his sword. Their eyes met, a mutual sense of shock passing between them. They had actually breached the Red Keep. The seat of Targaryen power was retaken, in a sense. At that moment, a gold cloak stumbled out of a side door, panting. He flung down his spear and fell to his knees. "Mercy, please. The Queen is inside with the Boy King. They mean to flee to the dungeons or the secret passages. They said they'd kill anyone who tried to open the gates." Daenerys exchanged a look with Robb. "Show us," she commanded, voice tight. The man nodded frantically, leading them into the keep. A small knot of northern men followed, along with a couple of Renly's knights who caught up. They passed corridors lined with tapestries and statues, some scorched or vandalized. Cowering servants looked on in terror. Eventually, they reached a locked metal gate near the dungeons. Shouts echoed beyond. One of Renly's knights battered the gate with a mace, forcing it open. Daenerys and Robb led the way into a dim corridor lit by torches. On the far end stood Cersei Lannister in a torn gown of crimson silk, her golden hair disheveled, face twisted in rage. Beside her was Joffrey, clad in partial armor that seemed too large for his spindly frame. His eyes darted wildly. A few Lannister guards ringed them, swords drawn. At the forefront was the Hound, blood on his face, teeth bared. He glared at the intruders. Cersei recognized Daenerys, a flicker of shock and scorn on her face. Joffrey snarled, "You have no right. I'm the king, He brandished a short sword, trembling. The corridor fell silent except for heavy breathing. Robb leveled his blade, stepping forward. "Surrender, Joffrey, in the name of the realm. You have no claim to the throne. End this slaughter." Joffrey let out a shrill laugh. "I'll see you all dead. I'm the king. Mother." "Tell them." Cersei spat, This is treason. We should have burned you all long ago." Daenerys stepped forth, ignoring the bile in her throat. "Joffrey Baratheon, I call you by your true name, a bastard of incest with no claim. The realm has risen against you. Surrender now, or we'll take you by force." The hound gritted his teeth. "I want no part in this, but I won't let you kill the boy on my watch." He raised his sword, though there was weariness and perhaps a flicker of despair in his eyes. Robb lifted his hand. "We don't want to kill him if it can be avoided, but he must yield." Joffrey screeched, "I'll never yield." He lunged forward in a wild, unskilled slash aimed at Robb. The hound tried to block him, but Joffrey was beyond reason. Robb sidestepped swiftly, knocking the boy's sword aside with a clang that nearly tore it from Joffrey's grip. Joffrey stumbled, eyes wide in terror. Cersei rushed to her son's side, turning on the hound. "You! Protect him! Fight them, you coward!" The hound's face tightened. His burnt skin twitched. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might attack. Then he shook his head, dropping his sword with a clang. Cersei stared in disbelief. "Traitorous dog!" He snarled, "I've had enough. This city is burning and the boy's mad. They've got dragons. I'm done." Seeing the hound yield, the Lannister guards behind them faltered. One by one, they dropped swords. Cersei hissed in rage, but Joffrey was trembling, half collapsed. Robb approached carefully, sword leveled, while Daenerys watched from just behind him. Joffrey spat, tears streaming. "You'll all pay for this. My father was the king. I am the king." He tried to raise his sword again, but it shook in his grip. Robb knocked it away with a swift blow, sending it clattering. Daenerys stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Your father was Robert Baratheon, but you are no true Baratheon. The realm is done with you. Order your men to stand down, or face the consequences." Joffrey crumpled to his knees, sobbing in fury and fear. Cersei glared daggers at Daenerys, voice shaking with loathing. "You'll regret this. The Lannisters always." "Enough!" Robb cut her off, raising a hand. "It's over. Guards, take them into custody." Northern men stepped in, seizing Joffrey and disarming Cersei despite her protests. The hound watched with hollow eyes, then turned and walked away, not stopping when the guards called after him. Daenerys let him go. He had no fight left. She exhaled, trembling with adrenaline, hardly believing it was real. Joffrey was in shackles, wailing. Cersei spat curses, eyes lit with hatred. The swirl of finality was overwhelming. They led the prisoners back out into the Red Keep's courtyard, where Allied forces had largely subdued the last pockets of resistance. A ring of men gathered to see Joffrey dragged forth in chains, to see Cersei's face twisted in indignation. Renly and Marjorie arrived, triumphant. The Great John let out a booming laugh, raising his warhammer. Robb clasped Daenerys' arm, relief and shock on his face. She realized King's Landing had fallen, Joffrey and Cersei captured. The Lannisters' hold shattered in mere hours of fierce fighting. In the distance, she heard cheers rising from the city as word spread that the gates had opened, that Joffrey was toppled. Some might have hoped for the end of tyranny. Others might just be celebrating new chaos. Renly stepped forward, eyeing Joffrey with disdain. "So ends your false reign, boy." He turned to Daenerys, a gleaming smile. "We've done it. The city is ours." Daenerys nodded, heart racing, mind whirling. Soldiers parted before her. She gazed up at the towers of the Red Keep, still wreathed in drifting smoke. In the hush that followed, she drew a breath to address the gathering men. "The Lannisters' false king has fallen," she proclaimed, voice echoing. "Let the city know, we bring a new dawn. Enough blood has been shed. Lay down your arms, and you shall have mercy." A ragged cheer rose. The wide eyes of the battered gold cloaks told her there would be no further organized resistance. Already, some had switched cloaks or torn off the Lannister sigil. Daenerys realized that while this battle might be over, the war was not. Tywin still lurked at Harrenhal. Stannis might contest them, and the question of who would rule remained. But in this moment, King's Landing had fallen to the combined might of the North, the Reach and the dragons. She raised her gaze to the black sky. Somewhere above, Rhaegal was wounded, perhaps needing urgent care. Drogon perched on a high parapet, letting out a triumphant roar that echoed across the battered city. For the first time since her ancestors lost the throne, a Targaryen stood in the Red Keep, victorious. Daenerys felt the enormity of it pressing in. She silently vowed to rule with the mercy and justice she had promised Ned Stark, to spare the city further horror. She would not be her father, nor would she yield to the realm's darkest impulses. Robb placed a hand on her shoulder, exhaling. "We did it." Daenerys gave a numb nod, gazing at the chaos around them. Blood-stained stones, cinders in the air, men cheering or weeping. "Yes, we've taken the city. Now we must decide what to do with it." Renly drew close, Marjorie by his side. His expression brimmed with ambition, even as sweat and soot clung to his brow. "We restore order," he said. "Then we seat ourselves on the Iron Throne, or see how the realm chooses its next ruler." His eyes flicked to Daenerys, the unspoken question hanging between them. She inclined her head, chest tight. "First, we must secure the city. Help the small folk, stop the fires, feed the hungry. That is what we do next." Her words carried across the courtyard, and many there, Northmen, Tyrell men, and city folk alike, lowered their weapons or pressed hands to hearts in relief. A tenuous hush fell as King's Landing changed hands. In that hush, Daenerys felt the weight of destiny wrap around her like a heavy cloak. The Targaryens had reclaimed the capital, but the shape of the future, for the realm, for the North, for the Southern Lords, was still unwritten. Still, in this moment, Joffrey's reign of cruelty was broken, the city trembling on the brink of a new age. Daenerys inhaled the smoky air and promised herself she would guide it toward a kinder dawn, if only the realm would let her. And so, under the bleak morning sky, with dragons perched on the scorched battlements, the next chapter of Westeros began.